Beneath the shifting skies of Central Europe, where forests once stretched unbroken and rivers carved silent borders, the story of Germany begins long before the word itself existed. This land, caught between Latin West and Slavic East, between the Alps and the North Sea, has always been a crossroads of fate. Here tribes resisted Rome beneath dark canopies. Here emperors dreamed of holy crowns and eternal authority. Here cities rose with commerce, princes ruled with ambition, and ideas erupted that would reshape all of Europe. Germany's history is not a straight road, but a long procession of transformations, kingdoms forming from fragments, unity emerging from division, brilliance shadowed by catastrophe, and rebirth following ruin. It is a story of poets and philosophers, of iron and industry, of war and reconciliation. From the ancient Germanic world to the modern republic at Europe's heart, Germany has repeatedly stood at the center of the continent's greatest struggles and achievements. To trace Germany's complete history is to walk through the very architecture of European civilization, its empires, its revolutions, its darkest hours, and its enduring capacity to rebuild. Chapter 1. Tribes Beneath Roman Shadows. In the dawn of an age before Germany was a name, before borders were drawn in ink and crowned capitals rose from stone, this land existed as something older and untamed. A vast, breathing world of forests, rivers, and mist. Central Europe was not yet a nation. It was a frontier of silence and motion, where oak canopies darkened the earth, where the Rhine and the Danube cut through wilderness like ancient veins, and where human life was shaped not by empires, but by seasons, kinship, and survival. To the south and west, Rome stood in disciplined grandeur, roads straight as spears, cities ordered by law, legions marching beneath banners of crimson. Rome called itself civilization. Beyond its frontiers, it saw only the unknown. And there, beneath the shadow of the imperial world, lived the Germanic tribes. They were not one people, but many: Cherusci, Suebi, Chatti, Marcomanni, Lombards, scattered communities bound by language families, warrior traditions, and fragile alliances. Their villages were small, built of timber and thatch, surrounded by fields wrested from forest soil. Their lives were intimate with nature, long winters that demanded endurance, summers that offered brief abundance, rivers that served as highways and borders alike. Rome called them barbari, outsiders. Yet the word revealed more about Rome's fear than their reality. The Germanic world was not empty chaos. It had its own structures, councils of elders, chieftains whose authority depended on loyalty rather than bureaucracy, warrior bands forged through honor and gift-giving. Power was personal, earned in battle and maintained through reputation. Society was fluid, resilient, and deeply rooted in land. By the 1st century BCE, Rome's gaze had turned northward. Julius Caesar, campaigning in Gaul, encountered Germanic warriors across the Rhine and wrote of them with both admiration and alarm. He described a people hardened by scarcity, uncorrupted by luxury, dangerous precisely because they lived outside Rome's reach. To Caesar, the Rhine became more than a river. It became a boundary between worlds. Yet Rome could not resist crossing boundaries. Under Augustus, the empire entered a phase of confident expansion. Rome had conquered Iberia, Gaul, the Balkans. Now it sought to push its frontier beyond the Rhine, to transform Germania into another province of the imperial system. Roman forts appeared along riverbanks. Roads began to cut into the wilderness. Traders followed soldiers, and with them came coins, wine, pottery, small objects carrying the weight of empire. For Rome, expansion was order. For the tribes, it was intrusion. At first, contact was not only war. Some Germanic leaders allied with Rome, gaining prestige through imperial favor. Others served as auxiliaries in Roman armies, learning Roman tactics, witnessing the machinery of conquest from within. Along the frontier, cultures mingled in uneasy proximity. Roman goods entered tribal life. Germanic recruits entered Roman ranks. But the deeper Rome pressed into the forests, the more fragile its control became. Germania was not Gaul. It had no single capital to seize, no centralized authority to co-opt. It was a mosaic of peoples, each with its own rivalries and loyalties. To conquer it required more than legions. It required understanding a world that refused to be organized. And Rome, in its confidence, misunderstood. In the year 9 CE, the tension between empire and frontier reached a breaking point that would echo through history. A Roman governor, Publius Quinctilius Varus, was tasked with administering the newly claimed German territories. He brought not only soldiers, but Roman law, taxation, courts, the assumption that Germania could be reshaped into a province like any other. To Varus, the tribes were subjects in waiting, but among those tribes was a man who understood Rome better than Rome understood him. His name was Arminius. A chieftain of the Cherusci, Arminius had been trained by Rome itself. He had served in the Roman military, earned citizenship, learned the discipline of legions and the arrogance of imperial certainty. To the Romans, he seemed a loyal ally, a bridge between worlds. In truth, he was something far more dangerous. Beneath the canopy of northern forests, Arminius began weaving alliances among tribes that had long distrusted one another. He spoke not of conquest, but of survival. Not of glory, but of freedom. Rome was no longer a distant force across the Rhine. It was here, building forts, demanding obedience, turning tribal lands into imperial property. And so, quietly, a storm gathered. In late summer, Varus was lured into the Teutoburg forest, led by Arminius's guidance into terrain that swallowed Roman formation and visibility. Rain fell. Mud thickened the paths. Trees closed in like walls. The legions, heavy, disciplined, built for open battle, found themselves stretched along narrow tracks, vulnerable and blind. Then, the forest erupted. Germanic warriors struck from the shadows with ferocity born of homeland defense. For 3 days, Rome's legions were dismantled in the wilderness. Standards fell. Commands vanished into chaos. The empire's greatest military machine was rendered helpless by weather, terrain, and betrayal. When it ended, 3 Roman legions were gone. Varus, facing annihilation, took his own life. And Rome, mighty, confident Rome, was forced to reckon with a truth it had tried to ignore. Beyond the Rhine was not merely land to conquer. It was a world that resisted. The Battle of Teutoburg Forest did not create Germany. The tribes remained divided, their unity temporary. But the psychological boundary had been drawn. Rome would never again attempt such deep conquest east of the Rhine. The frontier hardened. 2 worlds remained facing one another across river and forest, civilization and wilderness, empire and autonomy, Rome and Germania. And in that resistance, in that refusal to be absorbed, the earliest roots of a future identity began to stir. Not a nation yet, but a memory, a frontier spirit beneath Roman shadows. In the aftermath of Teutoburg, the forest did not celebrate. It simply returned to silence. The rain still fell through the branches, the rivers still moved northward, and the broken armor of Rome lay scattered beneath moss and soil like a warning carved into the earth. For the Roman Empire, the shock was immediate and profound. Augustus, the emperor who had believed Germania could be folded neatly into the imperial map, is said to have cried out in grief, "Varus, give me back my legions." It was more than a military defeat. It was a rupture in Rome's sense of inevitability. The empire had encountered something it could not easily digest, an enemy without a capital, a wilderness without roads, a people who could vanish into their own landscape. Rome responded, as empires always do, with force, with vengeance, with determination to restore authority. In the years that followed, Roman armies returned to the Rhine frontier under Germanicus, a gifted commander, an heir to imperial prestige. The legions marched again into German lands, not to govern this time, but to punish. Villages were burned. Warriors were hunted. Battles were fought along rivers and marshes where the air itself seemed heavy with memory. Germanicus recovered the lost legionary standards, those sacred symbols taken at Teutoburg, and Rome treated their return as a spiritual restoration, as if the empire could reclaim honor by retrieving bronze and cloth from the mud. But even Germanicus could not change geography. He could win battles, yes. He could devastate tribes, yes. But he could not transform Germania into Gaul. The cost was too high, the terrain too unforgiving, the tribal structure too decentralized. And so, gradually, Rome's ambition narrowed. The Rhine became the line. Rome fortified it, planted watchtowers along its bends, built camps that evolved into towns, Colonia Agrippina, Mogontiacum, early seeds of cities that would one day be Cologne and Mainz. The frontier was no longer a temporary boundary of expansion. It was permanent architecture, walls, forts, patrol routes, the edge of the Roman world. On one side, the ordered empire. On the other, the shifting tribal sphere. Yet the story was not one of separation alone. It was also a story of contact. Along the borderlands, trade flowed quietly, even as armies watched one another. Roman merchants exchanged wine, metalwork, and coin for amber, hides, and slaves. Germanic elites adopted Roman luxuries, not as submission, but as symbols of status within their own societies. Rome, for all its pride, was becoming entangled with the world it could not conquer. And Germania, for all its independence, was being changed by proximity. The tribes themselves were never static. They moved, merged, fractured, renamed themselves across generations. Pressure came not only from Rome, but from the vast migratory currents of Europe, peoples shifting east and west, climates changing, resources tightening, rivalries intensifying. By the 2nd century, new tribal confederations began to form, larger groupings born from necessity. The Alemanni emerged in the south, the Franks in the west, the Goths further east, beyond the immediate Roman horizon. These were not ancient nations awakening. They were fluid coalitions forged by war, opportunity, and the growing gravitational pull of Rome's presence. And Rome itself was changing. The empire that had once expanded effortlessly now struggled to maintain its immense borders. Legions were stretched thin, political instability grew, emperors rose and fell with alarming speed. The frontier was no longer just a line of conquest, it was a line of defense. In the 3rd century, the crisis deepened. Germanic raids increased not as random savagery, but as calculated movement toward wealth, land, and survival. Roman towns along the frontier felt the tremor of insecurity. Watchfires burned at night. Garrisons waited for shadows to move in the trees. Sometimes the tribes came as enemies, sometimes as recruits. Rome increasingly relied on Germanic soldiers within its own armies. Men from beyond the Rhine fought for imperial pay, learned Latin commands, wore Roman armor, and returned home with new knowledge of the empire's strengths and its vulnerabilities. The boundary between Rome and Germania was no longer purely external. It ran through people, through loyalties, through identity itself. By the 4th century, the frontier world had become a zone of transformation. Germanic leaders negotiated with emperors. Some were granted land inside the empire as foederati. Allied peoples settled in exchange for military service. Rome, once the absorber of nations, was now bargaining for survival. And beyond the Rhine, the tribal world watched Rome with a mixture of fear, admiration, and hunger. The empire was still immense, still powerful, but no longer unshakable. The forests of Germania had not defeated Rome outright, yet they had revealed that Rome could be resisted, that imperial destiny was not guaranteed. In this long tension between conquest and autonomy, between border and exchange, something enduring was forming. Not a unified German people, not yet, but the foundations of a future Europe, where Roman legacy and Germanic strength would eventually collide, merge, and remake the continent. The shadow of Rome still stretched across the rivers, but beyond it, the tribes endured. And the next great transformation was approaching, one that would not merely test Rome's frontier, but unravel the empire itself. In the twilight centuries of Rome's dominance, the Rhine frontier no longer felt like the edge of civilization. It felt like the edge of an era. The empire still possessed marble cities and imperial titles, still spoke in the language of eternity, but along its northern borders, the old certainty was fading. The legions remained, yet they were no longer invincible. The frontier forts still stood, yet beyond them, the tribal world was shifting into something larger, more organized, more historically inevitable. The Germanic tribes had not become a nation, but they were becoming forces. By the late 4th century, a storm arrived from further east, one that Rome could not control and the tribes could not ignore. The Huns, mounted warriors from the Eurasian steppe, pressed into Europe with terrifying speed. Their arrival was like a seismic shockwave, driving entire peoples westward in desperation. Among them were the Goths. Fleeing the Huns, Gothic groups reached the Roman frontier and begged for asylum across the Danube. Rome, strained but still proud, allowed entry, yet managed it with corruption and cruelty. Food was withheld, families were exploited, hunger turned to fury. In 378 CE, the tension erupted at the Battle of Adrianople, where Roman forces suffered one of their worst defeats in centuries. An emperor was killed. A myth shattered. Rome could fall in open battle. And if Rome could fall, then the world beyond its borders was no longer merely barbarian. It was the future pressing inward. In the decades that followed, Germanic peoples moved not only as raiders, but as migrants, settlers, and rulers in waiting. The Visigoths marched through the Balkans and eventually into Italy. In 410, they sacked Rome itself, an event that echoed across the Mediterranean like the end of a dream. For centuries, Rome had been the eternal city. Now it was vulnerable stone. Yet even as the Western Empire weakened, the Germanic world was not simply destroying Rome. It was inheriting it. Tribal leaders adopted Roman titles. Germanic kings ruled over Roman populations. Roman law, Christian faith, and imperial administrations survived, not as Roman power, but as cultural legacy carried forward by new hands. The tribes beyond the Rhine, once scattered in forests, were now shaping kingdoms on the ruins of empire. The Franks, in particular, rose in the Western Germanic sphere. Under leaders like Clovis in the late 5th century, they forged a powerful realm in former Roman Gaul, blending Germanic warrior tradition with Roman Christian institutions. This was not the birth of Germany yet, but it was the beginning of a medieval order that would emerge from Rome's collapse. The ancient tribal world was transforming, no longer just villages and chieftains. Now dynasties, now states, now the architecture of Europe's next age. And still, the land itself remained constant. The Rhine flowed as it always had. The forests still whispered in winter winds. But the meaning of this frontier had changed. Once it had been Rome's boundary against the unknown. Now it was the cradle of something new, post-Roman Europe, where Germanic strength and Roman inheritance fused into the foundations of the medieval world. The story of the tribes beneath Roman shadows is not merely a tale of resistance. It is the opening movement of a much longer transformation. How the peoples outside empire became the heirs of empire. How the so-called periphery became the center. How history's future often waits beyond the borders of its present. Germany as a nation was still far beyond the horizon, but the deep roots were there, in language, landscape, memory, and the slow hardening of identity across centuries of contact and conflict. From Teutoburg's rain-soaked ambush to the migrations that reshaped continents. The Germanic world had stepped onto the stage of history, not as a unified state, but as a defining presence. And as Rome's shadow lengthened into dusk, the medieval dawn approached. Thus ended the first chapter of Germany's story, where forests resisted emperors and the frontier became destiny. And in the centuries ahead, from these scattered tribal worlds, kingdoms would rise, and the idea of Germany would begin its long, complicated birth. Chapter 2. The birth of medieval kingdoms. In the fading light of Rome's Western Empire, Europe entered an age of profound uncertainty. The marble cities still stood, the aqueducts still carried water, the imperial titles still echoed in distant courts. But beneath the surface, the ancient order was unraveling. The legions that once guarded the frontiers were fewer now, stretched thin across an empire too vast, too strained, too exhausted to remain whole. And along the Rhine and beyond the forests of Germania, the world was moving, not as a single invasion, not as one conquering nation, but as a slow, unstoppable migration of peoples, Germanic groups who had once lived in the shadow of Rome, now stepping into the vacuum of its collapse. In the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire did not fall in one dramatic moment. It weakened gradually, like a great tree rotting from within. Political instability shook its foundations. Emperors rose and vanished in rapid succession. Civil wars drained resources. Economic systems faltered. And the frontiers, once guarded with iron discipline, became porous. Germanic peoples crossed not only as enemies, but as settlers, federated allies, and future rulers. The Visigoths established a kingdom in Iberia. The Vandals carved out power in North Africa. The Ostrogoths ruled Italy for a time. And in the lands of the Rhine frontier, a new force emerged, one that would shape the future heart of Europe. The Franks. They were not one tribe at first, but a confederation. Germanic warrior groups clustered along the lower Rhine. For generations they had lived near Rome's border, sometimes raiding, sometimes trading, sometimes serving as soldiers within the empire itself. They understood Rome's strengths, and now, increasingly, its weakness. As Roman authority withdrew, the Franks moved into the spaces left behind, not merely to destroy, but to rule. In the late 5th century, a Frankish leader rose whose reign would mark a turning point in European history. His name was Clovis. Clovis was young, ambitious, and ruthless, a king of the Merovingian dynasty. Through war and alliance, he expanded Frankish power across northern Gaul. Roman officials still existed in fragments, but Clovis was building something new, Germanic kingship on Roman soil. And then came a decision that would echo through the centuries. Clovis converted to Christianity. In a world where many Germanic rulers followed Arian forms of the faith, Clovis embraced the Catholic Christianity of Rome. It was not merely spiritual, it was political. This conversion aligned the Franks with the powerful church institutions that survived Rome's collapse. It gave Clovis legitimacy in the eyes of Roman populations and bishops. It fused Germanic warrior rule with Christian authority. Thus, from the ashes of empire, a medieval kingdom began to rise. The Frankish realm was not Rome reborn, but it carried Rome's inheritance, Latin administration, Christian structure, the memory of imperial order, woven into a new Germanic fabric. Over the next 2 centuries, the Frankish kingdom expanded, fractured, and expanded again. Merovingian kings ruled, but power increasingly shifted to the officials beneath them, the mayors of the palace, the men who commanded armies while kings became symbols. And from this shadowed political transformation emerged a new dynasty, the Carolingians. In the 8th century, a man named Charles Martel halted an Islamic expansion into Gaul at the Battle of Tours in 732, securing Frankish dominance in Western Europe. His victory was more than military. It established the Franks as defenders of Latin Christendom. His son, Pepin the Short, took the next step. In 751, Pepin deposed the last Merovingian king and was crowned ruler with the blessing of the Pope. A new alliance was forged, Frankish kingship and papal authority bound together in mutual survival. And then, in the late 8th century, Pepin's son inherited the throne, a figure who would loom over European history like a mountain over the horizon. Charles the Great, Charlemagne. Under Charlemagne, the Frankish kingdom became an empire. His armies marched across Saxony, Lombardy, and beyond, expanding Frankish control into the Germanic heartlands. His rule was both brutal and visionary, warfare fused with administration, conquest paired with reform. Charlemagne built schools, standardized governance, encouraged learning, and imagined a unified Christian Europe under a single imperial crown. And on Christmas Day, in the year 800, in the ancient city of Rome, the Pope placed a crown upon his head. Charlemagne was proclaimed emperor. In that moment, the dream of Roman authority was revived, not as the old empire, but as something transformed. A Christian empire rooted in Germanic kingship. It was a rebirth of imperial ambition. And yet, beneath the glory, the seeds of fragmentation remained. For this empire was vast, diverse, and held together by one man's will, and history does not allow such unity to last forever. When Charlemagne died in 814, Europe held its breath. The question was no longer whether the empire could expand, but whether it could endure. When Charlemagne died in 814, the empire did not collapse overnight. It lingered, immense, proud and uncertain, like a cathedral still standing after the architect is gone. For more than 4 decades, Charlemagne had held together a realm stretching from the Atlantic to the edges of Central Europe. He had ruled not only through armies, but through an idea, that Western Europe could once again be united beneath a single Christian emperor, heir to Rome's memory. But empires built on one man's authority often reveal their fragility the moment he disappears. Charlemagne's son, Louis the Pious, inherited the crown. He was devout, sincere, and deeply committed to the Christian mission of the empire. Yet he lacked his father's iron dominance. His reign became consumed not by expansion, but by internal strain, familial conflict, aristocratic ambition, and the ancient problem of succession. The Frankish Empire was not a modern state. It was a personal realm, bound to dynastic inheritance. And Louis had multiple sons, each expecting a portion of power. As Louis attempted to divide the empire among them, unity began to fracture. Brothers turned against brothers. Noble factions shifted loyalties like tides. Civil war erupted across the heart of Europe. By the 830s and 840s, the empire was no longer a single force marching outward. It was a divided house, fighting within itself while new dangers gathered at its borders. To the north, Viking raiders struck along rivers, burning towns and monasteries. To the east, Slavic groups and steppe peoples pressed against frontier zones. To the south, Islamic powers remained active. In the Mediterranean, the empire that Charlemagne had built was being tested from every direction, external pressure and internal disintegration simultaneously. Then, in 843, the Frankish world reached a decisive moment. The Treaty of Verdun. Charlemagne's grandsons agreed to divide the empire into three realms. West Francia, the foundation of what would become France. Middle Francia, a long, unstable corridor stretching from Italy through the Low Countries. And East Francia, the Eastern Kingdom, Germanic in language, frontier, and identity. This division was not intended to create nations. It was a dynastic compromise. But history would transform it into something far greater. East Francia was different from the Western lands. It contained the old tribal regions of Saxony, Bavaria, Swabia, and Franconia, Germanic territories only recently integrated into the Frankish Christian world. Roman influence was weaker here, and local dukes held immense autonomy. The king ruled, but power remained dispersed, negotiated constantly with regional elites. This was not yet Germany, but it was the soil from which Germany would grow. Over the next century, East Francia faced a brutal reality. Survival required strength, not just titles. The Carolingian line weakened. Kings struggled to command loyalty across distant duchies. And then came a new terror from the east. The Magyars. Mounted raiders swept into Central Europe in the late 9th and early 10th centuries, striking with speed and devastation. East Francia's fragmented political structure seemed helpless against them. Villages burned. Armies failed to respond in time. The realm's very existence was at stake. In this crucible, East Francia began to change. The dukes and nobles realized that a stronger kingship was necessary. Not an emperor in distant Rome, but a ruler capable of defending the land. In 919, a Saxon duke was chosen as king, Henry the Fowler. His election marked a shift. Power was no longer purely Carolingian inheritance. It was becoming Germanic kingship, rooted in regional strength and military necessity. Henry fortified towns, built defences, and stabilized the kingdom. He did not yet claim imperial grandeur. His focus was survival, but his son would go further. Otto I. In the mid-10th century, Otto confronted the Magyar threat directly. In 955, at the Battle of Lechfeld, Otto's forces achieved a decisive victory, ending the Magyar raids and securing East Francia's future. It was more than a military triumph. It was a moment of emergence. A German kingdom had proven itself capable of defending Europe's heart. Otto's authority expanded. The dukes were brought more firmly under royal control. The church became an instrument of governance, and in 962, Otto travelled to Rome, where he was crowned emperor. Thus, from the fractured Naslidi of Charlemagne's empire, a new imperial order was born. Not Roman in origin, not Frankish in unity, but German in its core. The Holy Roman Empire would soon rise from East Francia's foundation, carrying both the dream of Rome and the realities of German fragmentation. The pattern was clear. Germany's origins were not forged through a single birth. They were forged through division, reinvention, and survival. An empire broken into kingdoms, a kingdom hardened into identity, and a frontier realm becoming the heart of medieval Europe. By the mid-10th century, the lands of East Francia were no longer merely a remnant of Charlemagne's shattered dream. They were becoming something distinct, a kingdom of German-speaking peoples shaped not by Roman urban life, but by duchies, frontier warfare, and the slow discipline of medieval kingship. Saxons, Bavarians, Swabians, Franconians, once separate tribal worlds, were now bound, uneasily, beneath a single crown, not united as a nation, but connected by necessity. And at the centre of this transformation stood Otto I. His victory over the Magyars at Lechfeld in 955 had done more than end raids. It had altered the psychological map of Europe. For generations, the eastern frontier had been a zone of terror and instability. Now it was secured. East Francia had proven itself not as a peripheral kingdom, but as the defender of the continent's heart. In the wake of Lechfeld, Otto's authority deepened. The dukes who had once challenged royal power were forced into a new relationship with the crown. Otto did not eliminate regional autonomy. Germany would never become a centralized monarchy like France, but he strengthened kingship through alliances with the church. Bishops and abbots were appointed as imperial administrators, loyal not through bloodline, but through office. The church became the scaffolding of governance, binding scattered territories into a shared political order. This was medieval statecraft, power built through negotiation, ritual, and sacred legitimacy. And Otto understood something fundamental. In this world, kingship was not enough. To rule at the center of Europe was to inherit Rome's memory. And so, Otto looked southward. Italy, fragmented and contested, still carried the prestige of the ancient imperial capital. The papacy, vulnerable to local rivalries, sought protection. Otto marched across the Alps, not as a conqueror in the Roman sense, but as a German king stepping into the vacuum of Italian instability. In 962, in the city of Rome itself, Otto was crowned emperor. The title was immense, Imperator Romanorum, Emperor of the Romans. And yet, the reality was new. This was not the empire of Augustus. This was not Charlemagne's Frankish unity. This was an empire whose core lay in German lands, whose power depended on dukes, bishops, and shifting alliances, and whose identity would forever be shaped by fragmentation as much as grandeur. Thus began the Holy Roman Empire, an institution that would dominate Central Europe for nearly 1,000 years. But its birth carried the same paradox that defined Germany's origins: unity born from division, imperial ambition constrained by regional autonomy, a realm powerful enough to claim Rome's crown, yet too decentralized to become a single nation-state. The German kingdom was not forming through clean borders, but through layers of history, tribal roots, Frankish inheritance, Christian authority, military survival, and imperial reinvention. This was the medieval German world emerging. Not as a finished identity, but as a process, a frontier becoming a center, a broken empire becoming a new order, and the legacy of Charlemagne remained, not in unity, but in the pattern of Europe itself. Kingdoms rising from imperial ruins, power reshaped through faith and warfare, and the German lands standing at the crossroads of the continent's destiny. The birth of medieval kingdoms was not a simple beginning. It was a transformation of the ancient world into the medieval one, from tribal forests to crowned kings, from migration to monarchy, from Rome's collapse to a new imperial dawn. And as Otto's empire took shape, a deeper question lingered beneath the ceremonies and crowns. Could this vast German-centered realm ever truly hold together? Or would its very diversity become the source of future struggle? For in the centuries ahead, the Holy Roman Empire would grow into a complex constellation of princes, cities, bishops, and emperors, an empire both magnificent and perpetually divided. Thus, the foundations of Germany were laid not in a single act of creation, but in the slow, complicated birth of medieval kingship. And from this imperial beginning, the next chapter unfolds, where Germany's identity would be shaped by the rise of a sacred empire and the long tension between local power and universal ambition. Chapter 3: The Holy Roman Empire rises. In the dawn of the 10th century, the world that had replaced Rome was still unfinished. The Western Empire was gone, its marble authority dissolved into kingdoms, bishoprics, and frontier realms. Yet Rome's ghost endured, not in legions, but in ideas. The idea that order must have a center, that Christendom required a protector, that somewhere above kings and dukes, an emperor might still stand as the guardian of a sacred civilization. And in the heart of Europe, the German lands were rising into that role. East Francia, no longer merely a fragment of Charlemagne's divided inheritance, had become a kingdom forged by survival. Saxon kings defended the frontier, dukes ruled vast regions, bishops held cities like fortresses of faith. Power was scattered, negotiated, personal. And yet, above this mosaic, a new ambition was taking shape. Otto I, crowned king in 936, understood the nature of the realm he inherited. Germany was not France. It was not a centralized monarchy. It was a constellation of duchies: Saxony, Bavaria, Swabia, Franconia, each with its own identity, pride, and military strength. To rule here was to balance, to command without crushing, to unify without erasing. Otto's reign became a long campaign of consolidation. He faced rebellions from dukes who resented royal authority. He confronted rivals within his own family. And always, beyond the eastern horizon, threats pressed against the kingdom's borders. Then came Lechfeld in 955. The Magyars, mounted raiders who had terrorized Europe for generations, were met and shattered by Otto's army. The victory was decisive, almost civilizational in its weight. It ended the age of Magyar raids and transformed Otto from a regional king into the defender of Christian Europe. In the medieval imagination, such victories were not merely military. They were divine. Otto's authority grew not only from swords, but from sacred legitimacy. Kingship became more than governance. It became mission. And so Otto looked southward, toward the land where imperial titles still carried ancient power. Italy was fractured, contested by local nobles and rival kings. The papacy, vulnerable and politically entangled, sought protection. Rome itself, though diminished, remained the symbolic heart of Western Christianity. To be crowned in Rome was to step into the continuity of empire. Otto crossed the Alps like a figure from legend, yet his journey was entirely historical. A German king moving into Italy's chaos with armies, bishops, and ambition. In 962, within the ancient city of Rome, Otto was crowned emperor. Thus, the Holy Roman Empire was born, not as a rebirth of ancient Rome in truth, but as a medieval transformation of Rome's memory. This empire was holy because it was bound to Christianity, crowned by the Pope, imagined as the earthly defender of the faith. It was Roman because it claimed the prestige of the Caesars, the universal authority of the old world. And it was, in reality, profoundly German, rooted in the kingship of the German lands, dependent on their dukes, their bishops, their warrior aristocracy. From the very beginning, the Holy Roman Empire carried a paradox at its core. It was an empire of immense title, but fragmented substance. Unlike Rome, it had no centralized bureaucracy. Unlike later nation-states, it had no unified administration. It was a constellation: duchies, bishoprics, abbeys, free imperial cities, each with its own laws, privileges, and ambitions. The emperor did not rule like an absolute monarch. He negotiated. He persuaded. He travelled endlessly from court to court, holding assemblies, confirming rights, binding loyalties through ritual and patronage. The empire was not a single machine. It was a sacred network, and the church was its foundation. Otto and his successors relied heavily on bishops and abbots, appointing them as imperial officials. This imperial church system gave emperors loyal administrators who could not pass power to heirs. It was a strategy of control in a realm where hereditary dukes might rebel. Thus, politics and religion became inseparable. A cathedral was not only a house of worship, it was a pillar of governance. A bishop was not only a spiritual shepherd, he was a prince of the empire. Germany's medieval identity emerged in this tension: imperial ambition above, local autonomy below. The empire dreamed of universality, yet lived in decentralization. And still, the idea of empire mattered. To be emperor was to stand at the summit of Christendom, to claim a role not merely as king of Germans, but as the protector of Western civilization itself. Yet the question lingered beneath the golden crown: could such an empire ever truly be unified? Or would its very structure ensure perpetual struggle between emperor, pope, princes, and cities? For the Holy Roman Empire had risen, but its story was only beginning. The Holy Roman Empire, born in ceremony and crowned with ancient prestige, was never a finished creation. It was an evolving experiment, an empire unlike Rome, unlike Byzantium, unlike any centralized kingdom of the medieval West. Its strength lay not in uniform control, but in the enduring idea that the German king, crowned emperor, stood as the secular guardian of Christendom. Yet, ideas, in medieval Europe, were never uncontested. From the moment Otto I received the imperial crown, the empire entered a world of competing authorities, between throne and altar, between universal ambition and local power, between the dream of unity and the reality of fragmentation. Otto's successors inherited not only his title, but his burdens. The empire stretched across German lands into northern Italy, a realm of immense diversity. Mountains and rivers separated regions. Local dukes guarded their privileges fiercely. Free cities grew wealthy through trade. Bishops ruled territories like princes. The emperor could not simply command. He had to travel, negotiate, reward, threaten, and persuade. And yet, the imperial vision demanded more. To be emperor was to claim supremacy over kings. To be crowned in Rome was to step into a sacred role that blurred the line between politics and divine order. This sacred authority became both the empire's foundation and its greatest source of conflict. In the 11th century, the tension between emperor and pope sharpened into one of the defining struggles of medieval history: the investiture controversy. At its heart was a question that struck directly at the empire's structure. Who held the right to appoint bishops? For German emperors, bishops were not merely churchmen. They were administrators, territorial rulers, pillars of imperial governance. To appoint them was to secure loyal officials across the realm. For reforming popes in Rome, this was intolerable. The church, they argued, must be free from secular control. Spiritual authority could not be granted by kings. Bishops were servants of God, not instruments of emperors. Thus began a clash not only of personalities, but of worldviews. In 1075, Pope Gregory X issued reforms forbidding lay investiture, the emperor's practice of appointing bishops. The emperor at the time, Henry IV, refused to yield. The conflict escalated rapidly. Gregory excommunicated Henry. Suddenly, the emperor's sacred legitimacy was shattered. In a deeply religious society, excommunication was not symbolic. It was political annihilation. Princes began to question loyalty. Rebellion stirred. And so, in the winter of 1077, Henry IV crossed the Alps to the castle of Canossa. There, in the snow, he waited barefoot for days, seeking forgiveness from the Pope. The image became legendary not because it was myth, but because it revealed medieval Europe's reality. Even an emperor could be humbled before spiritual authority. Yet, forgiveness did not end the struggle. The investiture controversy continued for decades, tearing at the empire's cohesion. German princes exploited the conflict to expand their autonomy. The emperor's dependence on local power deepened. The empire remained vast in title, yet increasingly decentralized in practice. This was the Holy Roman paradox: an emperor crowned as universal ruler, yet constrained by princes, bishops, and papal power. Still, the empire was not merely conflict. It was also one of Europe's great engines of cultural and urban growth. Across the German lands, towns expanded into thriving cities. Markets filled with merchants speaking dozens of dialects. Cathedrals rose in stone, towering above rooftops as symbols of both faith and civic pride. Monasteries preserved learning, copied manuscripts, and shaped medieval intellectual life. The empire was not a nation-state. It was a civilization space, a vast central European world where local identities flourished beneath a shared imperial framework. Pre-imperial cities like Nuremberg and Frankfurt gained privileges directly from the emperor, becoming islands of autonomy amid princely territories. Trade networks expanded along the Rhine and Danube. Wealth flowed through guilds and markets, strengthening urban independence. And yet, this prosperity also reinforced fragmentation. Every prince, every bishop, every city guarded its rights. The emperor's authority was real, but never absolute. The Holy Roman Empire endured because it was flexible, because it could contain contradictions. Unity in symbolism, diversity in practice. It was not a single state. It was a constellation held together by ritual, law, and memory. And through it all, Germany's medieval identity was being shaped. Imperial in ambition, local in reality, sacred in ideology, decentralized in structure. The empire had risen as the heir of Rome's prestige, but its destiny would be defined not by centralized power, but by the endless negotiation between universal dreams and regional autonomy. By the 12th century, the Holy Roman Empire stood as one of the grandest political creations in medieval Europe. Its emperors carried titles that echoed with Roman antiquity. Its bishops ruled in splendor. Its cities grew rich behind walls of stone. Its princes governed territories that felt like kingdoms within the empire itself. And yet, beneath the imperial crown, the central truth remained unchanged. This was not an empire of unity. It was an empire of balance. The Holy Roman Empire endured not because it crushed diversity, but because it contained it, an intricate constellation of powers orbiting a sacred center that was always contested, always negotiated. In the reign of emperors like Frederick thus Barbarossa, the imperial vision reached one of its most dramatic heights. Barbarossa, crowned in 1155, sought to restore the dignity of imperial authority, especially in Italy, where wealthy northern cities increasingly resisted imperial control. He imagined the emperor not as a wandering mediator, but as a ruler of universal supremacy. His campaigns south of the Alps were fierce and symbolic. Armies marched into Lombardy. Imperial banners flew over contested ground. Yet Italy was not Germania, and the cities of Milan and Venice were not passive subjects. They fought back with alliances, wealth, and papal support. Barbarossa's struggle revealed again the empire's defining tension. Imperial ambition confronted by local autonomy, not only among German princes, but among Italian communes and the Church itself. Even at the height of its grandeur, the Holy Roman Empire could not become a centralized state. it could only remain an imperial framework, magnificent, but fractured, and that fracture shaped Germany's future. Unlike France or England, where monarchs gradually concentrated authority, the German lands developed as a patchwork of principalities, bishoprics, and free cities. Each region guarded its privileges fiercely, and emperors depended on cooperation rather than command. This decentralization was not merely weakness. It was a distinct medieval order, a political culture where law, tradition, and negotiated rights mattered as much as conquest. The empire's institutions evolved: imperial diets, assemblies of princes, legal customs that bound ruler and ruled together in complex hierarchy. Germany became imperial not through uniformity, but through multiplicity. And still, the empire's sacred dimension endured. The emperor was crowned as protector of Christendom, yet continually entangled in rivalry with the papacy. The memory of Canossa lingered like a scar, proof that spiritual authority could humble imperial pride. Thus, the Holy Roman Empire remained suspended between heaven and earth, a political realm clothed in sacred meaning, a secular power constrained by religious legitimacy. Its legacy was not a unified Germany, but a medieval German identity defined by contradiction, universal in imagination, regional in reality. For centuries, the empire would persist, shaping Central Europe's destiny, providing a framework where cities flourished, culture deepened, and local powers hardened into lasting autonomy. It was an empire that could not become a nation, yet it became the stage upon which Germany's history would unfold. And as the medieval centuries advanced, the empire's decentralized structure would give rise to new forces: commerce, cities, reform movements, and eventually, profound spiritual upheaval. The Holy Roman Empire had risen from Otto's coronation as a sacred continuation of Rome, but its future would not be written in imperial certainty. It would be written in tension, in fragmentation, in transformation. And so, as cathedrals climbed into the sky and princes tightened their grip on their lands, Germany moved forward into a new era, one where wealth and trade would reshape society as much as crowns and crusades. For the next chapter awaits, when towns, merchants, and the pulse of commerce began to change the medieval German world from within. Chapter 4: Cities, Trade, and Power. In the high medieval centuries, as the Holy Roman Empire endured in its vast, decentralized complexity, a quieter revolution began to unfold, one not driven by emperors or crusades, but by merchants, markets, and the rising hum of city streets. Between the 12th and 15th centuries, Germany changed not through sudden conquest, but through gradual transformation. The forests that had once sheltered tribes, and the castles that had once symbolized feudal power, now stood alongside something new. Towns swelling into cities, river ports crowded with ships, workshops ringing with hammer strikes, and marketplaces alive with voices from across Europe. In this era, wealth began to move differently. Power began to take new forms. The medieval German world was still politically fragmented. Princes ruled territories. Bishops governed ecclesiastical lands. Emperors travelled from court to court. But beneath this patchwork, urban life was rising like a tide. The cities of German lands were not merely settlements, they were engines. Along the Rhine, the Danube, and the Baltic coast, towns expanded behind stone walls. Streets narrowed between timber houses. Church spires pierced the sky. Guild halls stood as monuments to craft and commerce. The smell of leather, smoke, spices, and river air mixed in the daily rhythm of urban life. Here the medieval economy awakened. Merchants carried cloth, salt, wine, grain, and metalwork across long distances. Riverboats moved goods along watery arteries. Roads, though dangerous, connected fairs and market towns. The German lands, positioned at the crossroads of Europe, became a meeting ground for trade between north and south, east and west. And with trade came independence. Many towns gained charters granting them privileges, the right to hold markets, build walls, govern themselves through councils. These were not democratic freedoms in the modern sense, but they represented something profound, a shift in medieval power. A town could become an authority unto itself. A burgher merchant could rival a knight. Coin could speak as loudly as the sword. In cities like Cologne, Mainz, Strasbourg, and Regensburg, wealth accumulated in merchant houses and guilds. Skilled artisans organized into associations that regulated labor, protected quality, and shaped civic politics. The urban middle class, still small, still fragile, began to emerge as a force within the medieval world. Germany's future strength was already forming here, not in imperial coronations, but in workshops and counting houses. And nowhere was this urban commercial transformation more visible than in the north. Along the Baltic and North Sea coasts, German port cities grew into gateways of a new economic order. Lübeck, Hamburg, Bremen, names that would become synonymous with maritime power, expanded with shipyards, warehouses, and merchant fleets. The sea itself became a highway. Across cold northern waters, trade connected Scandinavia, England, the Low Countries, and the eastern Baltic. Timber, furs, wax, fish, and grain moved westward. Cloth, salt, and finished goods moved eastward. To protect these routes, German merchants did something remarkable. They organized. Out of shared interest and mutual defense emerged the Hanseatic League, a network of cities bound not by empire or dynasty, but by commerce. By the 13th century, the Hanse was becoming a dominant economic force in Northern Europe. It was not a kingdom. It was not an empire. It was a mercantile alliance. Ships instead of armies, contracts instead of crowns. Yet its influence was immense. Hanseatic merchants established trading posts in foreign cities. They negotiated privileges with kings. They enforced blockades when necessary. In an age of feudal fragmentation, the Hanse represented a different kind of power, collective urban wealth. Germany, though politically divided, was becoming economically interconnected. And as cities prospered, they reshaped society itself. Cathedrals rose higher, financed by civic pride and merchant donations. Universities emerged, centers of learning and theology. Manuscripts circulated. Art and architecture flourished in Gothic stone and stained glass. This was not yet the Renaissance of Italy, but Germany's cultural life was deepening, carried by urban growth and intellectual exchange. Yet, prosperity also brought tension. Princes saw wealthy cities as prizes. Bishops sought to maintain ecclesiastical authority. Emperors relied on urban support, yet feared urban independence. The medieval German world was not moving toward unity. It was moving toward complexity. A land where feudal swords still mattered, but where money, trade, and civic autonomy were rising beside them. Thus, between the 12th and 15th centuries, Germany entered an era of gradual modernization, an age where the future began to whisper through the noise of marketplaces and the creak of ships' timbers. And the question that lingered beneath the prosperity was inevitable. In a realm so divided, who would ultimately command the wealth of the cities? As the cities of the German lands grew richer, they also grew more restless. Behind their walls, a new medieval world was forming, one where power was no longer defined solely by noble blood or feudal inheritance, but by trade networks, skilled labor, and the steady accumulation of coin. In an age still dominated by castles and cavalry, the city became an alternative center of gravity. And that shift changed everything. Urban independence was not granted freely. It was negotiated, fought for, and defended. Many towns sought the status of free imperial cities, answerable directly to the emperor rather than to local princes or bishops. This status offered protection, autonomy, and prestige, allowing cities to govern themselves through councils of merchants and guild leaders. In places like Nuremberg, Augsburg, and Frankfurt, civic institutions grew stronger. Markets expanded into international fairs. Craftsmen organized into powerful guilds that regulated production and shaped politics. The soundscape of Germany was changing. No longer only the clash of swords, but the ringing of anvils, the calls of traders, the chatter of multilingual streets. Yet wealth attracts rivalry. Princes looked upon prosperous towns as sources of taxation and influence. Bishops, whose ecclesiastical territories often included major urban centers, struggled to maintain authority over increasingly self-confident citizens. Conflicts erupted between city councils and noble overlords, sometimes spilling into violence. The medieval German world was a landscape of competing jurisdictions. A bishop might rule a city spiritually, while merchants ruled it economically. A prince might claim surrounding lands, while the city walls declared independence. The emperor, distant and itinerant, could grant privileges, but rarely enforce unity. Fragmentation remained the empire's defining condition. And yet, within this fragmentation, German cities became among the most dynamic in Europe. The Hanseatic League, centered on Lübeck, reached its height between the 13th and 15th centuries. It was a web of more than 80 cities bound together by shared commercial interests. Hanseatic merchants dominated Baltic trade, controlling the flow of grain, timber, fish, furs, and wax. Their ships moved like floating caravans across northern waters. Their warehouses filled with goods from Novgorod to London. Their influence reached royal courts, where kings bargained for Hanseatic support. The League could even wage economic war, blockading ports, enforcing monopolies, protecting its merchants with collective strength. In the north, commerce created a kind of maritime empire without a crown. In the south, a different economic transformation unfolded. Cities like Augsburg became centers of banking and finance. Merchant dynasties such as the Fugger family rose to extraordinary prominence, lending money to emperors and popes alike. Wealth was no longer only in land. It was in capital, credit, and trade. This was a profound shift. Feudal society had been built on agricultural estates and knightly service. Now urban capitalism, still embryonic, still medieval, was emerging. Germany's workshops produced textiles, metal goods, weapons, and luxury items. Mining regions in the Harz Mountains and Bohemia supplied silver and other resources. German merchants became intermediaries of Europe's economy. The empire, though politically decentralized, was economically vibrant, and with prosperity came cultural flowering. Gothic cathedrals rose as monuments not only of faith, but of civic ambition. Cologne Cathedral, begun in the 13th century, stood as a testament to urban pride and religious devotion intertwined. Artisans carved stone into lace-like arches. Stained glass transformed sunlight into sacred color. Universities appeared, Heidelberg in 1386, among the earliest, drawing scholars into the German intellectual sphere. Monasteries copied manuscripts. Mystical movements stirred within late medieval Christianity, seeking deeper spiritual experience beyond formal structures. Germany was not a cultural backwater. It was a crossroads of commerce and thought. Yet the era was not only growth. The 14th century brought crisis. The Black Death swept through Europe, devastating populations, emptying streets, collapsing labor systems. Entire villages vanished. Cities, once symbols of vitality, became places of mourning and fear. Economic life eventually recovered, but social tensions sharpened. Peasant unrest simmered. Urban guilds clashed with patrician elites. Princes sought stronger territorial control, while cities defended autonomy. Thus, prosperity coexisted with instability. The medieval German world was advancing toward modernization, yet still bound by division and conflict. And beneath the bustling markets and towering cathedrals, the deeper question remained. Could this fragmented constellation of cities, princes, and bishops ever become something unified? Or would Germany's strength always emerge from diversity rather than central power? By the 15th century, the German lands of the Holy Roman Empire stood at a crossroads of medieval history. The cities had grown powerful. Trade had woven invisible threads across rivers and seas. Merchant wealth had risen beside feudal nobility. Cathedrals and guild halls towered over streets once shaped only by castle and church. Germany was transforming. Yet it remained, politically, a mosaic, a constellation of territories where emperors held titles of universal grandeur, but princes guarded local authority, bishops ruled ecclesiastical domains, and free cities defended their privileges with fierce pride. This coexistence of prosperity and fragmentation became the defining paradox of late medieval Germany. In the north, the Hanseatic League continued to dominate Baltic commerce, binding cities together through shared economic interest. Lübeck stood as the queen of the Hanse, its warehouses filled with goods from across Europe. German merchants negotiated with Scandinavian kings and Russian princes, shaping trade routes as decisively as armies shaped borders. In the south, banking houses like the Fugger dynasty grew into financial giants. Their loans reached emperors and popes, revealing a new reality. Money could move empires. The medieval economy was no longer purely agrarian. Capital, credit, and urban industry were becoming forces of history. And yet, even as Germany prospered, the old medieval order was straining. Territorial princes began consolidating their lands, building stronger administrations, seeking greater independence from imperial authority. The emperor, elected rather than hereditary, depended increasingly on negotiation with powerful regional rulers. The empire endured, but its unity remained symbolic. Cities, too, faced internal tensions. Guilds demanded representation. Patrician elites defended their dominance. Social conflicts simmered behind the facade of civic prosperity. Urban life was dynamic, but never harmonious. Then came the deeper tremors of a changing age. The late 15th century was a threshold. Europe was moving toward the early modern world. Printing presses began to spread, most famously through Johannes Gutenberg's innovations in Mainz around 1450. Suddenly, texts could circulate faster than ever before. Ideas, once confined to monasteries and universities, could reach merchants, craftsmen, and townspeople. Knowledge was accelerating, and with it, the potential for upheaval. The Church, still central to medieval life, faced growing criticism. Corruption, indulgences, and distant authority stirred dissatisfaction among ordinary believers and reform-minded thinkers. Spiritual restlessness grew beneath the surface of outward devotion. Germany's cities, literate, connected, economically vibrant, became fertile ground for new movements of thought. Thus, the era of cities, trade, and power was not merely an age of medieval prosperity. It was the foundation of transformation. The workshops, markets, and ports of Germany were forging more than wealth. They were forging conditions for change. A society increasingly urban. A culture increasingly literate. An economy increasingly interconnected. And a political structure still fragmented, still vulnerable to forces that could not be contained by princes or emperors. Germany's future strength was already forming, but so too were the pressures that would soon fracture Christendom itself. For the same networks that carried cloth and salt across Europe would soon carry something far more explosive. Ideas, challenges, Reformation. The medieval German world had reached its height, and now stood on the edge of spiritual earthquake. And so, as commerce filled the cities and cathedrals reached toward heaven, the next chapter approaches, when faith itself would ignite revolution, and Germany would become the epicenter of a transformation that reshaped all of Europe. Chapter 5. Reformation and Religious Earthquake. In the early 16th century, the German lands of the Holy Roman Empire stood outwardly prosperous, yet inwardly restless. Cathedrals still dominated city skylines. Monasteries still rang with bells. The rituals of medieval Christianity shaped every stage of life, from baptism to burial, from harvest prayers to imperial coronations. Rome remained the spiritual center of Western Europe, and the Pope's authority stretched across kingdoms and centuries. And yet, beneath the surface of this sacred order, tension was building like pressure beneath stone. Germany was not a unified nation. It was a patchwork of princes, bishoprics, free cities, and imperial territories, each with its own loyalties. The emperor held the title of universal protector, but real power lay scattered among regional rulers. This fragmentation created fertile ground for something dangerous, a revolution of ideas. By 1500, Europe was changing rapidly. Trade networks expanded, urban literacy grew, universities multiplied, and Gutenberg's printing press, born in Mainz only decades earlier, had transformed communication itself. Words could now travel faster than armies. Pamphlets could reach markets, taverns, and workshops. The written page became a new battlefield. At the heart of Germany's spiritual life, many sensed decay. The Catholic Church was still immense, but its reputation was strained. Clerical corruption, political entanglement, and the selling of indulgences, certificates promising remission of sin's punishment, provoked anger among ordinary believers. For centuries, reformers had criticized abuses, but the system endured. Now the moment was approaching when criticism would become rupture. In the university town of Wittenberg, on the edge of Saxony, lived an Augustinian monk and professor of theology. His name was Martin Luther. Luther was not born a revolutionary. He was a man consumed by spiritual anxiety, haunted by the question of salvation. How could a sinful human stand righteous before God? The Church offered sacraments, confession, penance, indulgences. Yet Luther's study of Scripture led him toward a radical conclusion. Grace was not purchased. Salvation was not earned through transactions. It was received through faith. In 1517, the spark ignited. A Dominican preacher named Johann Tetzel was selling indulgences near Wittenberg, raising funds for the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. His message was blunt, almost commercial. As soon as the coin clinked in the chest, the soul would spring from purgatory. To Luther, this was a betrayal of the gospel. And so, on October 31st, 1517, Luther issued his 95 Theses, a list of arguments challenging the theology and practice of indulgences. Tradition holds that he posted them on the door of the castle church in Wittenberg, a place where academic debates were announced. Whether nailed dramatically or circulated quietly, the effect was the same. The words spread like wildfire. Printers reproduced the theses across Germany. Within weeks, Luther's challenge reached far beyond Wittenberg. Within months, it reached all of Europe. This was no longer a scholarly dispute. It was a spiritual earthquake. Rome could not ignore it. At first, church authorities demanded Luther recant. They expected obedience. After all, monks had questioned before, and Rome had survived. But Luther's defiance hardened. His writings grew sharper. He challenged not only indulgences but the authority of the Pope itself, insisting that Scripture, not Rome, was the ultimate foundation of Christian truth. The conflict escalated rapidly. In 1520, Luther was condemned by the Pope. In 1521, he was summoned before the Diet of Worms, an imperial assembly convened under Emperor Charles V. The scene was heavy with historical gravity. Princes in robes, bishops in splendor, imperial power and church authority gathered together. Luther stood alone. Asked to recant his writings, he refused. "Here I stand." Tradition remembers him saying, "I can do no other." Whether spoken exactly or not, the meaning was undeniable. A single German monk had challenged the unity of Western Christendom. Luther was declared an outlaw. His life was forfeit. Yet he did not vanish. Protected by Frederick the Wise, Elector of Saxony, Luther was hidden in Wartburg Castle. There, in isolation, he translated the New Testament into German, an act of immense cultural consequence. Scripture was no longer confined to Latin clergy. It could now speak in the language of ordinary people. The Reformation was becoming more than protest. It was becoming transformation. Germany had become the epicenter of a revolution that would reshape faith, politics, and identity forever. And as Luther's words traveled through printing presses and princely courts, the question facing Europe grew unavoidable. Could the Church remain one? Or had the fracture already become permanent? The outlaw monk of Wittenberg was no longer merely a man. Martin Luther had become a symbol, a spark that had ignited forces far beyond his control. By the early 1520s, the German lands trembled with spiritual energy. Luther's writings poured from printing presses in unprecedented numbers. Sermons echoed through city churches. Debates erupted in universities, marketplaces, taverns. For the first time in European history, a theological dispute was becoming a mass movement, carried not by bishops alone, but by ordinary believers hungry for change. The Reformation spread because Germany was ready for it. The Holy Roman Empire's fragmentation meant that no single authority could silence Luther quickly. Princes held immense autonomy. Free cities governed themselves. Some rulers saw Luther's ideas not only as spiritual truth, but as political opportunity. To embrace reform was to weaken Rome's influence. To seize church lands was to gain wealth. To assert independence was to strengthen regional power. Thus, the Reformation was never purely religious. It was inseparable from politics. Emperor Charles V, ruler of a vast Habsburg domain stretching from Spain to the Americas, recognized the danger. He remained committed to Catholic unity. Yet his empire was too large, his enemies too many. He faced wars against France, pressure from the Ottoman Turks, and internal instability. Germany became a fire he could not easily extinguish. Meanwhile, reform accelerated. In many German cities, Catholic rituals were dismantled, monasteries closed, priests married, worship shifted into the vernacular, new Protestant identities formed almost overnight. Luther himself urged moderation, seeking reform rather than chaos. But once unleashed, movements rarely remain contained. And chaos did come. In 1524, the German Peasants' War erupted. Peasants across southern and central Germany, inspired partly by reformist language of spiritual freedom, rose against their lords, demanding relief from crushing feudal burdens. They cited scripture, believing divine justice supported their cause. For a moment, it seemed the Reformation might become a social revolution. But Luther recoiled. He condemned the uprisings, urging princes to restore order. The revolt was crushed with brutal force. Tens of thousands died. The episode revealed a painful truth. The Reformation would not automatically bring equality. It would reshape faith, but power would remain contested. As the decade progressed, Germany divided more sharply. Some princes remained loyal to Rome. Others embraced Lutheranism. Religious identity became territorial. A ruler's faith determined the fate of his lands. The empire, already politically fragmented, was now spiritually fractured as well. In 1530, Charles V attempted reconciliation at the Diet of Augsburg. Lutheran princes presented their beliefs in the Augsburg Confession, a foundational Protestant statement. But compromise failed. Positions hardened. In response, Protestant territories formed the Schmalkaldic League, a defensive alliance against imperial force. Germany was becoming a landscape of armed confessions. Catholic versus Protestant. Emperor versus princes. Unity versus autonomy. The struggle erupted into open war in the 1540s. Charles V achieved temporary victories, but lasting control proved impossible. The empire's structure meant that religious settlement required negotiation, not conquest. Finally, in 1555, the Peace of Augsburg established a fragile principle, cuius regio, eius religio, whose realm, his religion. Each prince could choose Catholicism or Lutheranism for his territory. It was not tolerance. It was legalized division. Western Christianity, once unified beneath Rome, was now permanently fractured. Germany's internal fragmentation deepened into a defining feature of its history. The Reformation strengthened regional rulers, weakened imperial centrality, and ensured that faith would remain inseparable from politics. Yet, the Reformation was also a cultural transformation. Luther's German Bible shaped the development of the German language. Protestant emphasis on literacy encouraged education. Hymns, sermons, and printed texts reshaped everyday spiritual life. Germany had become the epicenter of a revolution not only of doctrine, but of identity. Ideas had overturned the medieval order, and the tremors were far from finished. For the Peace of Augsburg settled only Lutheranism and Catholicism, leaving other movements, Calvinism, radical sects, outside the agreement. The empire's spiritual fault lines remained unstable, and in the century ahead, Germany would pay the price of this division in the most devastating conflict it had ever known. By the mid-16th century, the German world had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. What began in 1517 as a monk's protest against indulgences had become a permanent fracture in Western civilization. The Reformation was no longer an argument within the Church. It was the remaking of the Church. And Germany stood at the center of that rupture, its cities, princes, and people transformed by the most powerful force of all, an idea whose time had come. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 brought a temporary stillness, like the pause after an earthquake when dust settles, but the ground remains unstable. The principle of cuius regio, eius religio, legalized division. Princes could choose Catholicism or Lutheranism, and their subjects would follow. It was a settlement born not of harmony, but exhaustion. Germany remained a patchwork, now not only of political territories, but of confessional worlds, Catholic bishoprics beside Protestant duchies, Lutheran cities beside imperial strongholds loyal to Rome. Faith had become geography. Religion had become power. And the Holy Roman Empire, already decentralized, was now spiritually splintered. Yet the Reformation's legacy was not only conflict, it was also cultural rebirth. Luther's translation of the Bible into German reshaped language itself, giving the German-speaking world a shared literary foundation. Protestant emphasis on scripture encouraged literacy, schooling, and education. Printing presses multiplied across German towns, flooding Europe with pamphlets, hymns, catechisms, and polemics. The written word became a weapon. The sermon became a force. The individual conscience became a battlefield. The medieval world, with its unified Latin Church, was fading. In its place emerged a new Europe, diverse, fractured, modernizing. But Germany paid a unique price for standing at the epicenter. The Reformation strengthened territorial rulers. Princes seized church lands, expanded administrations, and gained authority at Rome's expense. The emperor's dream of universal unity weakened further. Germany's political fragmentation deepened into a long-term condition. Unlike France or England, which moved towards centralized monarchy, the German lands became increasingly plural, dozens of states, each guarding its confession and autonomy. The empire endured, but as a contested framework rather than a unified nation. And beneath the surface, unresolved tensions continued to build. The Peace of Augsburg recognized only Catholics and Lutherans. Other movements, Calvinists, Anabaptists, radicals, remained outside the settlement. Confessional boundaries blurred, rivalries sharpened. Each generation inherited a divided spiritual landscape. The Reformation had unleashed forces that could not be contained by treaties. By the late 16th century, Europe was entering an age of religious polarization. Catholic reforms surged through the Counter-Reformation. Protestant identities hardened. Alliances formed not only around dynasties, but around belief. Germany, fragmented and central, became the fault line of Europe. And so the Reformation's ultimate lesson emerged with clarity. Ideas can overturn empires more decisively than armies. A theological dispute in a small Saxon town had shattered the unity of Western Christianity, reshaped politics, empowered princes, transformed culture, and set the stage for future catastrophe. Germany's history, again and again, pivoted not only on battles, but on intellectual and spiritual revolutions, moments when belief reshaped reality. The Reformation was one such moment, perhaps the greatest. It opened the door to modernity, but it also opened the door to war. For when faith becomes territorial, when salvation becomes political, when princes defend doctrine with swords, the result is not merely division, it is devastation. And in the century ahead, the German lands would become the battlefield of Europe's most destructive religious conflict, a war that would consume cities, villages, and generations. Thus, as church bells rang in rival confessions and the empire stood fractured beneath competing truths, Germany moved toward its next great trial. For the next chapter approaches, when the divisions born in Reformation would erupt into the flames of the 30 Years' War, and the German world would descend into one of the darkest catastrophes in its history. Chapter 6. The 30 Years' Ruin. In the 17th century, the German lands entered a darkness so deep that it would scar their memory for generations. The Reformation had shattered the unity of Western Christianity, but the fractures did not heal, they hardened. Princes ruled by confession, cities prayed in rival tongues, Catholic and Protestant Europe stood facing one another like armed camps, each convinced of divine truth, each fearing extinction. And Germany, fragmented, central, vulnerable, lay directly in the path of the coming storm. The Holy Roman Empire was vast in name, but fragile in reality. It was not a single state, but a constellation of hundreds of territories, duchies, bishoprics, free cities, imperial knights, each guarding autonomy with fierce pride. The emperor, seated in Vienna, carried the title of universal ruler. Yet his authority depended on negotiation with princes who often obeyed only when it suited them. This was an empire of compromise, and compromise was breaking. By the early 1600s, tensions had reached a boiling point. Protestant rulers feared Catholic resurgence, Catholic leaders feared Protestant expansion. The Counter-Reformation, driven by Jesuits and imperial power, sought to reclaim lands for Rome. Protestant alliances formed in response. The empire became a tinderbox of suspicion. Then, in 1618, the spark ignited in Prague. Bohemia, a kingdom within the empire, was largely Protestant. Yet the Habsburg Emperor sought to strengthen Catholic authority there. When imperial officials attempted to impose restrictions, Bohemian nobles erupted in defiance. In a moment that became symbolic of the war's beginning, Protestant nobles seized two imperial governors and threw them from a castle window, the defenestration of Prague. They survived the fall, but Europe would not survive what followed. The Bohemian revolt quickly escalated beyond local dispute. The rebels offered their crown to a Protestant prince, challenging Habsburg authority itself. Emperor Ferdinand II responded with force, determined to restore imperial control and Catholic unity. In 1620, the armies met at the Battle of White Mountain outside Prague. It was swift, decisive. The Bohemian rebellion was crushed. Protestant leaders were executed. Lands were confiscated. Catholicism was imposed with harsh intensity. Bohemia was transformed. What might have ended as a regional conflict instead widened into a continental catastrophe. For the war was no longer only about Bohemia, it was about the balance of Europe. Protestant states feared imperial domination. Catholic powers saw opportunity. Foreign kings intervened. The German lands became the stage upon which Europe's great powers would fight out their rivalries. Thus began the 30 Years' War, a conflict that would devour Germany like fire across dry fields. In its early phase, imperial forces advanced. Catholic armies, led by commanders like Johann Tilly, swept through Protestant territories. Towns fell. Armies lived off the land, requisitioning food, looting villages, leaving famine in their wake. War in the 17th century was not clean. It was not contained. Armies were vast, mercenary, and hungry. Soldiers were often unpaid, surviving through plunder. Civilians became targets not by strategy, but by necessity. Fields were trampled, crops burned, disease followed wherever troops marched. Germany began to bleed. In 1630, a new power entered. Sweden. King Gustavus Adolphus, a Protestant monarch and brilliant military reformer, landed on German shores with disciplined armies. To Protestants, he appeared as a savior, to Catholics as an invader. His intervention transformed the war into something larger than religion, a struggle of geopolitical survival. The conflict intensified. Battles raged across Saxony, Bavaria, along the Rhine. Cities were besieged. Villages vanished. The land itself became exhausted. In 1631 came one of the war's most infamous horrors, the sack of Magdeburg. Imperial troops stormed the Protestant city. Fire consumed streets. Tens of thousands were slaughtered. The name Magdeburg became synonymous with atrocity, a warning whispered across Europe. And still the war continued. The German world was descending into ruin, not as a single collapse, but as a prolonged unraveling. Year after year of hunger, violence, displacement, and fear. This was not merely a war of armies. It was a war against society itself. And as the 17th century moved deeper into chaos, Germany faced a question that felt unbearable. How much destruction could a land endure before nothing remained? By the 1630s, the 30 Years' War had become something far darker than its origins. What began as a conflict over religion within the Holy Roman Empire had transformed into a continental struggle for power, fought with merciless intensity on German soil. Catholic and Protestant banners still flew above armies, but behind them stood rival dynasties, foreign ambitions, and the cold logic of survival. Germany was no longer the spark. It was the battlefield. After Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden entered the war in 1630, the Protestant cause surged with renewed strength. His armies moved with discipline and modern tactics, cutting through imperial forces that had seemed unstoppable. At the Battle of Breitenfeld in 1631, Sweden achieved a stunning victory, shattering the myth of Catholic invincibility. For Protestant Germany, it was a moment of hope. But hope in this war was always fleeting. The fighting spread relentlessly. Armies marched not as liberators, but as consuming forces. Even allies devastated the lands they claimed to protect. Soldiers demanded food, shelter, payment. Villagers hid in forests, towns emptied. The countryside became a wasteland of burned farms and abandoned churches. And then, in 1632, Gustavus Adolphus fell at the Battle of Lutzen. The Swedish king died in the smoke of battle, and with him vanished the sense of Protestant salvation. Sweden remained in the war, but the conflict lost its heroic clarity. It became increasingly a grinding struggle without end. The German people endured the true weight of catastrophe. This was not warfare confined to armies. It was total collapse. Famine stalked the land. Harvests failed because fields were trampled or burned. Trade routes collapsed. Entire regions depopulated as villagers fled or perished. Disease followed soldiers like a shadow. Typhus, plague, dysentery, sweeping through weakened communities. In some areas, Germany lost a third of its population. In others, half. The war turned cities into graveyards and villages into silence. Parents abandoned children in desperation. Refugees wandered through ruined landscapes. Wolves returned to the outskirts of towns. The boundaries between civilization and wilderness blurred once again, as if history were reversing. And still, the conflict widened. By the mid-1630s, France, Catholic France, entered the war against the Catholic Habsburg Emperor. Religion had become secondary. Power was now the true engine. Cardinal Richelieu, Chief Minister of France, understood that Habsburg dominance threatened French security. Thus, France supported Protestant forces, not out of shared faith, but out of geopolitical necessity. The 30 Years' War became fully international. Spanish armies fought in the west. Swedish armies held the north. French forces pressed from the Rhine. Imperial troops struggled to defend a fractured realm. Germany was torn apart by foreign and domestic armies alike, its empire reduced to a chessboard of devastation. The Holy Roman Emperor, once imagined as the protector of Christendom, could no longer protect his own people. The empire's cohesion shattered further as princes pursued self-preservation above imperial loyalty. Alliances shifted constantly. The war became endless motion, marches, sieges, treaties broken, new campaigns launched. For civilians, there was no distinction between victory and defeat, only survival. The sack of Magdeburg had been a symbol, but it was not unique. Similar horrors unfolded across the land. Würzburg, Heidelberg, countless villages erased without record. Churches were looted, libraries burned, art vanished. Communities that had existed for centuries disappeared in weeks. This was Germany's great trauma. A war that did not merely change borders, but broke society. And yet even amid ruin, life endured in fragments. Some cities rebuilt walls. Some peasants returned to fields between campaigns. Faith persisted, though haunted by suffering. The German lands became a landscape of endurance as much as destruction. By the 1640s, exhaustion spread through Europe. Armies were drained, treasuries emptied. No side could achieve decisive victory. Diplomats began to gather, searching for peace not through triumph, but through necessity. The question was no longer who would win. It was whether Germany could survive at all. By the final decade of the 30 Years' War, Germany was no longer recognizable as the land it had once been. The conflict had consumed not only armies, but the foundations of society. Villages lay in ashes. Fields stood empty. Cathedrals echoed with absence. Trade routes that had once carried wealth through the empire were silent, haunted by bandits and broken bridges. This was not merely a war, it was an unmaking. The Holy Roman Empire, already fragmented before 1618, now seemed shattered beyond repair. Princes ruled like sovereigns, pursuing alliances for survival rather than loyalty. Foreign powers, France, Sweden, Spain, treated German soil as the arena for their own rivalries. The emperor's authority, once crowned with sacred grandeur, had been exposed as limited, fragile, dependent. Germany had become Europe's wound. And yet, by the 1640s, exhaustion finally began to outweigh ambition. No side could achieve total victory. The imperial forces were drained. Sweden's armies were stretched thin. France had gained ground, but at immense cost. The continent itself seemed weary of blood. Thus began the slow movement toward peace. In the towns of Münster and Osnabrück, diplomats gathered from across Europe. Negotiations lasted years. Delegations argued over borders, confessions, rights, reparations. It was diplomacy on an unprecedented scale, an attempt to end a war that had spiraled far beyond its origins. Finally, in 1648, the Peace of Westphalia was signed. The treaties did not restore Germany. They could not resurrect the dead or rebuild the vanished villages, but they ended the slaughter, and they reshaped Europe forever. Westphalia confirmed what the war had already revealed. The Holy Roman Empire was not a unified state, but a patchwork of territories with immense autonomy. Princes gained the right to conduct their own foreign policy. The empire's decentralization was not reversed, it was zackrepped into law. Germany's political fragmentation, already centuries old, became permanent reality. Religious division was also formalized. Catholics, Lutherans, and now Calvinists were recognized within the imperial framework. The dream of a single Christian Europe under one church was gone. The Reformation's fracture had become an enduring condition. Westphalia marked the beginning of a new international order, one based not on universal empire, but on sovereign states negotiating balance of power. Modern Europe was emerging from German ruin. The cost, however, was immeasurable. Some German regions lost up to half their population. Famine and plague had marched beside soldiers. Entire communities disappeared. The economy collapsed. Cultural treasures were destroyed. Trauma seeped into folklore and memory. The 30 Years' War became Germany's great catastrophe, a national scar long before Germany was a nation. And yet, from the ashes, endurance remained. The German lands would rebuild slowly, cities would recover, trade would return, life would continue, though forever shaped by what had been endured. The empire survived, but as a looser constellation, its unity more symbolic than real. The war taught a brutal lesson. When faith becomes weaponized, when politics becomes absolutist, when foreign powers exploit internal division, devastation follows without limit. Germany emerged from the 17th century not as a unified kingdom, but as a landscape of memories, ruin etched into stone, survival carved into identity. And in the centuries ahead, this fragmentation would shape everything. The rise of powerful states like Prussia and Austria, the struggle for dominance within the German world, and the long path toward eventual unification. Thus, the 30 Years' War was not only an ending, it was a turning point. The medieval empire's dream had been broken by modern brutality, and Germany's future would now be written in the shadow of this ruin. For the next chapter approaches, when new powers would rise from the fractured German lands, and the rivalry between Prussia and Austria would begin to define the next era of Central European history. Chapter 7: Prussia and Austrian Rivalry. In the silence after the 30 Years' War, Germany did not awaken into unity. It awakened into fragments. The Peace of Westphalia had ended the slaughter, but it confirmed what the war had made undeniable. The Holy Roman Empire was not a single state, but a shattered constellation of territories, hundreds of princes, bishops, and free cities bound together only by tradition and title. The emperor still wore the crown, but the empire no longer commanded. In the decades that followed, the German lands rebuilt slowly, village by village, city by city. Fields were replanted, markets returned, populations recovered. Yet the political landscape remained deeply divided, and within that division, something new began to rise. Power was concentrating, not in the empire as a whole, but in certain states within it. From the ashes of ruin emerged two forces that would come to dominate the German world, embodying two different destinies: Austria and Prussia. Austria was the heir of the old imperial tradition. Ruled by the Habsburg dynasty, it carried centuries of prestige, anchored in Vienna, stretching beyond German lands into Hungary, Bohemia, and the Balkans. Austria was not merely a German state, it was a multinational empire, Catholic, aristocratic, deeply tied to the legacy of the Holy Roman Crown. It represented continuity, the old order, imperial grandeur sustained by dynastic inheritance. Prussia, by contrast, was something sharper. It began as the Electorate of Brandenburg, a territory scattered across northern Germany, poor in natural resources, vulnerable to invasion. Yet its rulers forged strength not through wealth, but through discipline. In the 17th century, the Hohenzollern dynasty began shaping Brandenburg Prussia into a new kind of state, centralized, militarized, efficient. The great elector, Frederick William, who ruled from 1640 to 1688, understood the lesson of Germany's devastation. Survival required organization. He built a standing army, strengthened taxation, reduced the independence of nobles, and created an administrative machine that could mobilize resources with relentless precision. Prussia's power did not grow from ancient imperial titles. It grew from modern statecraft. By 1701, Brandenburg's ruler crowned himself king in Prussia, elevating his realm's status. The title was modest compared to Austria's imperial splendor, yet it signaled ambition. Prussia was stepping onto the European stage. In the 18th century, Germany became a landscape where the empire's old fragmentation masked a new reality. The future would belong not to the emperor, but to the strongest states within the empire. Austria and Prussia began to compete for leadership of the German world. Their rivalry was not inevitable from geography alone, it was ideological. Austria represented the traditional imperial model: dynastic, Catholic, multinational. Prussia represented a new militarized modernity: Protestant, disciplined, bureaucratic. Two visions of German destiny. The first great test came in the War of the Austrian Succession in the 1740s. When the Habsburg Emperor died without a male heir, Austria's throne passed to Maria Theresa. European powers challenged her claim, sensing weakness. Prussia's young king seized the moment. His name was Frederick II, Frederick the Great. In 1740, Frederick invaded Silesia, a wealthy Austrian province. It was a bold act of calculated aggression, executed with speed and precision. The Prussian army, drilled into near-mechanical discipline, achieved stunning victories. Austria fought back fiercely, but Silesia was lost. Prussia had announced itself as a great power. Frederick was not merely a warrior king. He was a strategist, an intellectual, a ruler who embodied Prussia's identity. Iron discipline fused with enlightened ambition. Under his reign, Prussia became a formidable force, challenging Austria's dominance and unsettling Europe's balance. Germany was still not one nation, but the struggle between Austria and Prussia was laying the groundwork for what would come. For the question of the German future was no longer abstract. It was becoming a contest of power. Which state would lead? Which vision would prevail? And in this rivalry, the instruments of unification were slowly being forged through reform, war, and relentless resolve. Frederick's seizure of Silesia was more than a territorial gain. It was a declaration. Prussia, once a peripheral northern state, had challenged Austria, the ancient pillar of imperial authority, and survived. In doing so, Frederick the Great altered the balance of power within the German world. The Holy Roman Empire still existed, but its center of gravity was shifting away from the emperor in Vienna toward rival powers competing beneath the imperial shell. Germany's destiny was beginning to take shape through rivalry. Austria, under Maria Theresa, did not accept humiliation quietly. She modernized her administration, reformed taxation, strengthened the army, and sought new alliances. The Habsburg monarchy, though rooted in tradition, proved capable of adaptation. Austria remained vast, wealthy, and determined. Thus, the German lands entered an era defined not by unity, but by dualism. Austria and Prussia became the two poles around which Central Europe revolved. This rivalry erupted again in the 7 Years' War, 1756–1763, one of the first truly global conflicts. On the European continent, it was a struggle for survival between Prussia and a coalition of enemies, Austria, France, Russia, and others, who sought to crush Frederick's rising power. Prussia stood vastly outnumbered, yet Frederick endured through brilliance, discipline, and sheer will. Battles like Rossbach and Leuthen became legends of tactical mastery. Prussia's army, small but relentless, fought with a precision that astonished Europe. The war nearly destroyed Prussia, but it did not break it. When peace came, Prussia remained standing. Silesia remained Prussian, and Frederick emerged as one of Europe's great rulers. Prussia had proven itself not merely a challenger, but a permanent great power. Austria, meanwhile, turned its attention increasingly towards southeastern Europe, expanding influence in the Balkans and consolidating its multinational empire. The Habsburgs remained the holders of the imperial title, but their German leadership was now contested. The German world was divided between two futures: Austria's imperial tradition and Prussia's militarized modernity. Yet the rivalry was not only about war, it was also about state building. Both Austria and Prussia developed stronger bureaucracies, more efficient taxation, standing armies, and administrative reforms. The 18th century became an age in which German states modernized not as one nation, but as competing powers sharpening themselves against each other. And beyond them, the rest of Germany remained fragmented. Dozens of duchies, bishoprics, and free cities caught between these giants. The empire's old structure persisted, but it was increasingly hollow, a medieval framework containing modernizing states. Then came the French Revolution. In 1789, the old European order began to collapse. Revolutionary France challenged monarchy itself, spreading new ideas of citizenship, nationalism, and mass mobilization. The wars that followed swept across the continent. For Germany, the French Revolution and Napoleon would be a profound shock. The Holy Roman Empire, already weakened, could not withstand the storm. In 1806, under Napoleon's pressure, the empire was dissolved. A 1,000-year institution vanished. Germany entered the 19th century without an empire, without unity, but with two rising powers, Austria and Prussia, still competing for leadership. The rivalry that began in the ashes of Westphalia had not ended. It had only entered a new stage, for in the century ahead, the question would become unavoidable. Which German power would shape the future nation? By the end of the 18th century, the rivalry between Austria and Prussia had become the defining axis of the German world. Germany was still not a nation. It was a landscape of kingdoms, duchies, free cities, and ecclesiastical territories, an inheritance of medieval fragmentation that had survived even the fires of the 30 Years' War. Yet within that fractured constellation, two states had risen like rival stars, each embodying a different future. Austria carried the weight of empire, Catholic, dynastic, multinational, rooted in the old imperial tradition of the Habsburgs. Prussia carried the sharp edge of modernity, Protestant disciplined, bureaucratic, forged through military efficiency and centralized reform. Their struggle was not merely for land. It was for leadership of the German destiny. Frederick the Great's wars had elevated Prussia into the ranks of Europe's great powers. Austria, though challenged, remained immense and resilient. Together they shaped Central Europe's balance, pulling smaller German states into their orbit. The Holy Roman Empire still existed in name, but it had become increasingly obsolete, a medieval structure housing modern forces. And then came the revolution that shattered the old world entirely. In 1789, the French Revolution erupted, unleashing ideas more dangerous than armies, popular sovereignty, nationalism, the end of dynastic inevitability. Europe's monarchies trembled. Revolutionary France soon turned outward, carrying war across the continent. For the German lands, the French Revolution and the rise of Napoleon were an existential shock. Napoleon did what centuries of emperors could not. He swept aside the ancient imperial framework. In 1806, under French domination, the Holy Roman Empire was dissolved. The 1,000-year institution that had begun with Otto's coronation vanished into history. Germany entered a new age unmoored from its medieval past. The old empire was gone, but the rivalry between Austria and Prussia remained. Indeed, it grew sharper. Napoleon reorganized German territories, reducing the patchwork of states, awakening new nationalist sentiment among Germans who experienced foreign domination. Prussia suffered humiliating defeat at Jena-Auerstedt in 1806, exposing the limits of its military system. Yet from this humiliation came reform. Prussia rebuilt itself with ruthless modernization, new military structures, administrative efficiency, and a growing sense of national purpose beyond dynastic rule. Austria, too, resisted Napoleon, seeking to preserve its imperial position. Thus, the rivalry evolved from 18th-century dynastic competition into something larger, a contest over the shape of modern Germany. The instruments of unification were being forged not in unity, but in struggle, through war, reform, and the pressure of history itself. Austria represented a German future tied to empire and multinational tradition. Prussia represented a German future tied to discipline, nationalism, and centralized state power. The question was no longer theoretical. It was inevitable. Which path would Germany take? The answer would come not immediately, but through the storms of the 19th century, through revolutions, industrial power, and the final showdown between these rival states. For now, in the ashes of empire and the shadow of Napoleon, Germany stood poised between two destinies, its future waiting to be decided by iron and ambition. And so the next chapter approaches, when Napoleon's domination would awaken German nationalism and the long road toward unification would begin in the crucible of conquest and resistance. Chapter 8. Napoleon and German Awakening. In the closing years of the 18th century, the old world of Europe began to collapse like a cathedral struck by lightning. For centuries, Germany had existed within the vast, complicated framework of the Holy Roman Empire, an ancient constellation of princes, bishoprics, and free cities bound together by tradition more than unity. Its emperors wore crowns heavy with medieval memory. Its territories remained fragmented, diverse, and deeply rooted in the old order. Then, from the West, came revolution. In 1789, France erupted into upheaval. The French Revolution shattered the assumptions of monarchy, aristocracy, and divine kingship. It proclaimed new principles: citizenship, popular sovereignty, the nation as a people rather than a dynasty. At first, German rulers watched with alarm from behind their borders. But revolutions do not remain contained. War followed. And from war rose a figure who would reshape Europe with unprecedented force: Napoleon Bonaparte. He was not merely a conqueror, he was a storm of modernity, an individual who carried the energy of the revolution into imperial ambition. His armies marched with speed, discipline, and mass mobilization, unlike the slow dynastic warfare of the past. Germany, fragmented and vulnerable, lay directly in his path. In 1806, Napoleon struck decisively against Prussia at Jena and Auerstedt. The Prussian army, once feared as Europe's most disciplined, collapsed in humiliation. Berlin fell. The old myth of Prussian invincibility was shattered, and in that same year something even older died. Under Napoleon's pressure, Emperor Francis II dissolved the Holy Roman Empire. A 1,000-year institution born with Otto's coronation in 962, shaped by medieval ambition, fractured by princes, scarred by war, vanished with a signature. The empire did not fall in flames. It ended in silence. Germany awoke to an unfamiliar reality. The old order was gone. Napoleon reorganized German territories into the Confederation of the Rhine, a collection of states under French dominance. Dozens of small principalities were swept away. Borders were redrawn. German rulers became satellites of French power. For many, Napoleon appeared as both destroyer and modernizer. He abolished feudal privileges in some regions, introduced legal reforms through the Napoleonic Code, and weakened the old aristocratic structures. Yet beneath these changes lay the deeper truth. Germany was occupied. Foreign domination settled over the German lands like a shadow. French troops marched through German cities. Taxes flowed westward. German soldiers were conscripted to fight Napoleon's wars. The humiliation was not only political, but psychological. For centuries, Germans had lived divided, loyal to princes and local identities rather than a unified nation. Now, under foreign rule, a new question emerged with burning clarity. Who are we? It was in this crisis that awakening began. Not first through armies, but through minds. German thinkers, poets, and philosophers began to imagine a shared identity beyond the patchwork of states. Johann Gottfried Herder spoke of a German folk, a people united by language and culture. Poets celebrated German history and folklore. Intellectuals sought meaning in a collective past. In 1807-1808, the philosopher Johann Gottlieb Fichte delivered his famous addresses to the German nation, calling for spiritual renewal and national education. Germany, he argued, must awaken from division, must rediscover itself through language, culture, and resistance. Nationalism was being born not as a state policy, but as a cultural dream. At the same time, reform swept through Prussia. Defeat had revealed weakness, and so Prussian leaders Stein, Hardenberg, Scharnhorst undertook radical modernization. Serfdom was reduced. Administration was reorganized. The army was rebuilt with new principles of merit and national service. Napoleon's domination, paradoxically, forced German states to modernize. Humiliation became transformation. The old empire was gone, but something new was stirring in its absence. The idea of Germany not as an imperial title, but as a nation of people. And as Napoleon's wars stretched across Europe, German resentment grew. The question was no longer whether the French emperor could conquer, but whether Germans could rediscover unity through resistance. for in destruction, awakening had begun. Napoleon's domination of the German lands was not only political, it was intimate. It entered daily life, through occupation, taxation, conscription, and the constant reminder that Germany's fate was being decided in Paris, not in Vienna, Berlin, or Frankfurt, Resumund. The Confederation of the Rhine, created under Napoleon's authority, bound German princes to him as clients. Many rulers cooperated, benefiting from territorial expansion and French protection. Yet their people often felt only the weight of foreign control. German soldiers marched under French banners into Spain, into Russia, into distant wars that were not their own. Germany's fragmentation, once accepted as tradition, now felt like weakness. And weakness, under occupation, becomes humiliation. Yet humiliation can become fuel. In universities, salons, and city streets, a new language of belonging began to spread. Writers and poets turned towards the German past, searching for roots deeper than princely borders. The Brothers Grimm collected folk tales, preserving cultural memory as if safeguarding a nation not yet born. Romantic thinkers celebrated forests, medieval legends, and the spirit of the German people. This was not escapism. It was identity building. National consciousness formed first as culture, a shared language, a shared imagination, a shared longing. In Prussia, the awakening became institutional. After the catastrophic defeat of 1806, Prussian reformers understood that survival required transformation. The old aristocratic military system, rigid and outdated, had failed. The state rebuilt itself with remarkable urgency. Gerhard von Schönhorst reformed the army, introducing merit-based promotion and preparing the foundations of universal conscription. Prussia began to imagine war not as dynastic contest, but as national struggle. Baron von Stein and Hardenberg reorganized administration, reducing feudal constraints and strengthening civic participation. Education was expanded, inspired by the belief that a nation's strength lay not only in weapons, but in knowledge and moral unity. Napoleon, unintentionally, was forging his own adversaries. Then came the turning point. In 1812, Napoleon launched his invasion of Russia, the greatest gamble of his career. Hundreds of thousands marched east, including many German contingents forced into his armies. The campaign ended in catastrophe. The Grand Army was destroyed by winter, distance, and Russian resistance. Europe watched the Emperor bleed. And in Germany, the moment of opportunity arrived. In 1813, Prussia broke from Napoleon's alliance. King Frederick William III issued a call to arms. The wars of liberation had begun. Across German lands, volunteers joined the fight. Students, intellectuals, ordinary citizens. Many saw the struggle not only as a political war, but as a national awakening. The Battle of Leipzig in October 1813, the Battle of Nations, became the largest conflict Europe had ever seen. Prussians, Austrians, Russians, Swedes, and other allies confronted Napoleon in a titanic clash on German soil. Napoleon was defeated. The spell was broken. French forces retreated westward. German territories were freed from direct French domination. In 1814, Allied armies entered Paris. Napoleon abdicated. For Germany, liberation was more than victory. It was revelation. Resistance had created a sense of unity that princes alone had never achieved. Germans had fought together, suffered together, imagined themselves together. Nationalism, once a cultural dream, was becoming a political force. Yet unity was still incomplete. When the Congress of Vienna met in 1815, Europe's rulers restored balance. Austria and Prussia remained rivals. Germany was reorganized into the German Confederation, a loose association of states, not a nation-state. The old fragmentation endured, but something irreversible had happened. The idea of Germany had awakened. Foreign domination had ignited self-definition. The 19th century would now be shaped by this tension between the dream of national unity and the reality of political division. When Napoleon fell, Germany did not immediately become a nation. The French emperor's defeat shattered his domination, but it did not dissolve the old German divisions overnight. The wars of liberation had awakened something powerful, a sense of shared struggle, a glimpse of unity forged in resistance. But the political reality remained complex, cautious, and deeply fragmented. In 1815, Europe's rulers gathered at the Congress of Vienna to rebuild the continent after 2 decades of revolution and war. Their goal was not to fulfill nationalist dreams, but to restore stability, monarchy, and balance of power. Austria, under the statesman Metternich, feared nationalism as a dangerous force. Prussia sought influence, but not yet revolution. The German lands were reorganized into the German Confederation, a loose association of 39 states bound together by diplomacy rather than national government. Germany remained a patchwork, but it was no longer the same patchwork as before, because the Napoleonic era had changed everything beneath the surface. The Holy Roman Empire was gone forever. The medieval framework that had contained German life for 1,000 years had dissolved in 1806, swept away by modern conquest. In its place emerged a new political landscape of fewer, larger states, more modern, more centralized, more capable. Napoleon had destroyed the old order, and in doing so, he had prepared the ground for something new. More importantly, the German awakening could not be undone. The cultural nationalism of poets and philosophers had fused with the lived experience of occupation and liberation. Germans had seen foreign troops in their streets. They had fought side by side in Leipzig. They had imagined themselves not merely as Saxons, Bavarians, or Prussians, but as part of something larger. The nation existed first as an idea, and ideas, once awakened, do not easily return to sleep. Prussia emerged from the Napoleonic era transformed. Its reforms, military, administrative, educational, made it one of Europe's most efficient states. Austria remained vast and imperial, but increasingly cautious, determined to suppress revolutionary nationalism. Thus, the rivalry between Austria and Prussia entered a new phase, no longer merely dynastic competition, but a contest over the future shape of Germany itself. The German Confederation became an arena of tension. Liberal movements demanded constitutions and unity. Conservative rulers defended sovereignty and order. Universities became centers of nationalist thought. Student fraternities waved black, red, gold colors, symbols of a Germany yet unrealized. The 19th century was beginning with unresolved questions burning beneath restored monarchies. What was Germany? A cultural people without a state, a federation of princes, a future nation waiting to be born. Napoleon's conquest had provided the catalyst. Foreign domination had ignited self-definition. Modernization had accelerated. The dream of unity had taken root. Germany stood at the threshold of a new age. The medieval world was gone. The modern world was arriving, and the forces unleashed in this era, nationalism, reform, rivalry, industrial power, would soon reshape Europe more profoundly than any emperor's crown. Thus, Chapter 8 is the story of awakening through destruction, how conquest ended an ancient empire, how occupation created unity, how resistance birthed nationalism, and how the German question, once dormant beneath centuries of fragmentation, became the central political problem of the 19th century. For the next chapters will follow that question to its climax, as Prussia and Austria compete for dominance, as revolution shakes Europe, and as Germany moves steadily toward unification through iron and blood. And so the next chapter approaches. when the dream of unity would be tested in the fires of nationalism and war, and the German Empire would begin to take shape through the decisive power of Prussia. Chapter 9. Unification through blood and iron. In the 19th century, the German land stood like a question carved into the heart of Europe. For centuries, Germany had been a civilization without a single state, a mosaic of kingdoms, duchies, and free cities bound loosely by language and memory, yet divided by borders and rival crowns. The Napoleonic era had awakened nationalism, but Vienna had restored fragmentation. The German Confederation remained a fragile compromise, a structure designed not to unify, but to contain. And yet, the idea of Germany could not be contained forever. Across Europe, the 19th century was an age of acceleration, factories rising beside rivers, railways stitching landscapes together, populations swelling in industrial cities. Power was no longer measured only in noble lineage, but in coal, steel, and disciplined armies. In this modern world, fragmentation was weakness. Unity was destiny. The question was no longer whether Germany would unify, but how. In 1848, revolutions swept across Europe. In German cities, liberals and nationalists gathered in Frankfurt's Paulskirche, attempting to create a unified German constitution. They dreamed of a Germany built on law, representation, and popular sovereignty. But the dream failed. Princes refused to surrender power. The Prussian king rejected a crown from the gutter, unwilling to accept unity granted by revolution rather than monarchy. Germany's unification would not come through parliament. It would come through power. And in the north, Prussia was rising, industrializing rapidly, reforming its army, expanding rail networks, and sharpening its administrative machine. Prussia was no longer merely a kingdom. It was the instrument of a future nation. In 1862, a man entered the stage of history whose name would become inseparable from German unity. Otto von Bismarck. He was not a romantic nationalist. He was not a revolutionary. He was a Prussian aristocrat, a master of calculation, a realist who understood that Europe was governed not by ideals alone, but by force, diplomacy, and timing. Standing before the Prussian parliament, Bismarck declared that the great questions of the age would not be decided by speeches and majority votes, but by blood and iron. It was a chilling statement of purpose. Bismarck's vision was clear. Germany would be unified under Prussian leadership, not Austrian. The old dualism of Central Europe would be resolved. Prussia would dominate. But to achieve this, he needed more than ambition. He needed war, carefully chosen, politically engineered, strategically limited. The first conflict came in the north, over the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein. These territories, culturally German yet ruled by the Danish crown, became the spark for confrontation. In 1864, Prussia allied with Austria, its rival, to wage war against Denmark. The war was swift. Danish forces were defeated. Schleswig and Holstein were seized. But victory created a new tension. Who would control the conquered lands? Prussia and Austria, allies in war, became enemies in peace. Bismarck had planned it. The duchies became the pretext for the second decisive conflict, the Austro-Prussian War of 1866. This was the turning point. For centuries, Austria had held the imperial mantle, claiming leadership of the German world. Now Prussia challenged that order openly. The war lasted only 7 weeks. Prussia's modernized army, equipped with rail mobility and needle guns, crushed Austrian forces at Königgrätz. The result was revolutionary. Austria was excluded from German affairs. The German Confederation was dissolved. Prussia emerged as the unquestioned leader of northern Germany. A new political structure formed, the North German Confederation, dominated by Prussia, binding German states together under Prussian authority. Unification was no longer a dream. It was advancing step by step. Yet southern German states, Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, remained outside. They hesitated, wary of Prussian dominance. Bismarck understood that only one force could bring them fully into unity: a common enemy. And in the West, France watched Prussia's rise with growing alarm. The stage was set for the final war. By 1866, the German question had been violently transformed. Austria, the ancient imperial rival, had been defeated and pushed out of German politics. The old Holy Roman legacy, once embodied in Vienna, was now irrelevant to Germany's future. Prussia stood dominant in the north, commanding a federation of states bound together through military and constitutional structure. Yet Germany was still incomplete. The southern kingdoms, Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, and Hesse-Darmstadt, remained independent, culturally German yet politically cautious. They feared Prussian control as much as they feared foreign threats. They hesitated between autonomy and unity. Bismarck knew the truth of 19th century politics. Nations are not forged only by treaties. They are forged by shared danger. Only an external enemy could overcome southern hesitation and bind Germans together in common purpose. And across the Rhine, France was watching. Under Emperor Napoleon III, France had long considered itself the dominant continental power. A unified Germany under Prussia threatened that balance. Prussia's victories over Austria had shifted Europe's center of gravity, and Paris felt the ground moving beneath it. Bismarck understood France's anxiety. He also understood how to provoke it. In 1870, a dispute arose over the Spanish throne. A distant dynastic question became a diplomatic crisis when a Prussian candidate was proposed. France demanded guarantees that Prussia would never support such a candidacy again. King Wilhelm of Prussia politely refused. Bismarck then edited the king's telegram, known as the Ems Dispatch, making it appear that France had been insulted and dismissed. The effect was immediate. French pride erupted. Napoleon III declared war on Prussia in July 1870. It was the war Bismarck had anticipated. And now the southern German states rallied to Prussia's side. Bavaria and Württemberg joined the conflict, not as Prussian subjects, but as German allies defending against France. In that moment, unity was no longer a political calculation. It became a national cause. The Franco-Prussian War unfolded with stunning speed. Prussia's military system, efficient rail mobilization, coordinated command, modern artillery, overwhelmed French forces. In September 1870, at the Battle of Sedan, Napoleon III himself was captured. The French Empire collapsed. But the war did not end. Paris resisted, besieged by German armies through the winter. The city endured hunger, cold, and bombardment. Across Europe, the scale of German victory was becoming undeniable. In January 1871, as the siege continued, German princes gathered in a place heavy with symbolism: the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. There, in the palace of France's kings, Wilhelm I was proclaimed German Emperor. The German Empire was born, not in Frankfurt's parliament, not through liberal revolution, but through monarchy, war, and Prussian power. Germany, long fragmented, had unified suddenly into Europe's strongest industrial and military state. The balance of power was rewritten. A new empire stood at the continent's center, powerful, ambitious, and young. Yet beneath the triumph lay tensions. The empire was federal, containing proud kingdoms under Prussian dominance. Democracy existed through the Reichstag, but real authority remained with the emperor and the chancellor. Unification was both achievement and the beginning of new pressures. A powerful Germany had arrived, and Europe would never be the same. In January 1871, amid the cold grandeur of Versailles, the long German journey from fragmentation to unity reached its defining moment. For centuries, Germany had been an idea without a single state, an empire of princes, a patchwork of loyalties, a civilization divided by borders and crowns. Now, in the Hall of Mirrors, that ancient division was sealed into history. Wilhelm V of Prussia was proclaimed German Emperor. The German Empire was born. The symbolism was immense. It was not in a German cathedral, not in Frankfurt's liberal assembly, but in the palace of France's kings, declared through conquest, monarchy, and Prussian strategy. The unification of Germany was not the triumph of democratic revolution. It was the triumph of power. Otto von Bismarck had engineered it with ruthless precision. 3 wars, each calculated, each limited, each designed to isolate an enemy and expand Prussia's leadership. Denmark had provided the opening. Austria had been the decisive rival. France had been the final catalyst. Through blood and iron, Germany had been forged. And the consequences were immediate. A unified Germany emerged as Europe's strongest industrial and military power almost overnight. Its population was vast. Its coal and steel industries surged. Railways connected its regions like arteries. Its army, disciplined and modern, became the continent's most formidable force. The balance of power that had shaped Europe since the fall of Napoleon was shattered. A new empire stood at the center of the continent. Young, ambitious, and immensely capable. Yet unification carried contradictions. Germany was unified, but not fully centralized. It remained a federal empire of kingdoms and states, with Prussia dominant above all. Bavaria kept certain privileges. Regional identities endured beneath the imperial banner. The Reichstag existed, elected by universal male suffrage, yet real authority lay with the Kaiser and the Chancellor. Democracy was present, but constrained. The empire was modern in industry, yet monarchical in structure. Thus, unity was both triumph and tension. Bismarck himself understood that Germany's birth created new dangers. A powerful, unified state would inevitably alarm its neighbors. France, humiliated and stripped of Alsace-Lorraine, burned with resentment. Austria, excluded from Germany, turned toward the Balkans. Russia watched cautiously. Britain observed a new rival rising in industrial strength. Germany's unification did not end Europe's struggles. It rearranged them. And within Germany, the pressures of modernity began to build. Rapid industrialization, social unrest, the clash between conservative elites and emerging working-class movements. The empire's unity had been achieved through war, but its future stability would require something more difficult: political balance, diplomacy, restraint. The German Empire was born in triumph, but it carried within it the seeds of future conflict. Nationalism sharpened, rivalries intensified, ambitions awakened. Unification was an ending, but also a beginning. Germany had finally become a nation-state, but now it faced the challenge of living with its own power. The 19th century had answered the German question, but it had opened another. What would this new empire do with its strength? For the next chapter, we'll follow Germany into the 20th century, where industrial might and imperial ambition would collide with the fragile order of Europe, leading towards the catastrophe of World War. And so the next chapter approaches. When the German Empire, newly forged, stepped onto the world stage, and the forces of modern conflict began to gather over Europe's future. Chapter 10: Empire, Industry, and World War. In the final decades of the 19th century, the German Empire rose with astonishing speed. Only recently unified through war and diplomacy, Germany now stood at the center of Europe as a new kind of power: industrial, scientific, disciplined, and ambitious. Its cities expanded beneath smokestacks and steel frameworks. Railways stitched together regions once divided for centuries. Factories thundered along the Ruhr. Laboratories and universities produced discoveries that placed Germany at the forefront of modern science. The empire was young, but it was immense. Under Kaiser Wilhelm I and Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, Germany's early years were marked by careful statecraft. Bismarck understood the danger of Germany's sudden strength. He sought stability through alliances, isolating France and avoiding reckless confrontation. Yet, history rarely allows stability to last. In 1888, Wilhelm II ascended the throne, a new emperor, impatient, ambitious, determined to claim Germany's place in the sun. Within 2 years, Bismarck was dismissed. The architect of cautious balance was gone. A new era began. Wilhelm II envisioned Germany not only as Europe's strongest land power, but as a global empire. The world, he believed, belonged to those who dared to compete for colonies, fleets, and prestige. Germany expanded its overseas possessions in Africa and the Pacific. It pursued a naval arms race, building battleships to challenge Britain's supremacy at sea. This ambition transformed Europe's atmosphere. Rivalries sharpened. Britain, long secure behind its navy, now saw a challenger rising across the North Sea. France, humiliated in 1871 and stripped of Alsace-Lorraine, waited with quiet determination for revenge. Russia, vast and unpredictable, watched German and Austrian influence press into Eastern Europe. The continent became a web of alliances and suspicions, where peace depended on fragile calculations. Germany allied with Austria-Hungary, binding itself to a multinational empire struggling with internal nationalism. France drew closer to Russia. Britain, alarmed by German naval expansion, moved toward cooperation with its old rivals. Europe was dividing into armed camps, and beneath diplomacy, the engines of modern warfare were turning. Industrialization meant that future wars would not be fought like those of Napoleon. They would be fought with machine guns, artillery barrages, rail mobilization, and entire economies devoted to destruction. By the early 20th century, Europe was tense with anticipation, like a storm-filled sky waiting for lightning. The spark came in the Balkans. In June 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was assassinated in Sarajevo by a Serbian nationalist. What might have remained a regional crisis instead triggered the alliance system like falling dominoes. Austria issued an ultimatum to Serbia. Russia mobilized in defense of Slavic kin. Germany pledged full support to Austria. France stood by Russia. Britain watched anxiously. Then, in August 1914, the continent plunged into war. World War I. Germany moved swiftly, executing the Schlieffen Plan, an attempt to defeat France quickly by invading through Belgium. But the advance stalled at the Marne. Trenches were dug. The Western Front froze into a brutal stalemate. What followed was industrial slaughter. Mud-filled trenches stretching for hundreds of miles. Artillery shells raining day and night. Machine guns cutting down waves of soldiers. Poison gas drifting across no man's land. A generation was consumed. Germany fought on 2 fronts, against France and Britain in the west, against Russia in the east. Early victories in the east brought territory, but the war's scale was endless. Blockades strangled German supplies. Hunger spread at home. The economy bent under total war. By 1917, the United States entered the conflict, tipping the balance. Germany's final offensives in 1918 failed. Exhaustion became collapse. In November 1918, revolution erupted. The Kaiser abdicated. The German Empire, born in triumph at Versailles, fell in defeat. And Germany entered a new, uncertain age. Its monarchy shattered, its people starving, its future unknown. The war that Germany had entered in August 1914 was expected by many to be swift, a decisive campaign, a test of strength. Instead, it became a machine of endless attrition. By the winter of 1914, the Western Front had solidified into trenches, long scars carved across France and Belgium. Soldiers lived underground in mud, rats, and freezing rain. Days were measured by artillery barrages, by the whistle of shells, by the constant presence of death. This was not heroic warfare. It was industrial annihilation. Germany's armies fought with discipline and endurance, but the conflict devoured men faster than any strategy could replace them. Battles like Verdun in 1916 became symbols of horror, months of bombardment, hundreds of thousands dead, victory meaningless amid the scale of loss. On the Somme, the British unleashed unprecedented offensives, and the landscape itself was pulverized into cratered wasteland. Germany, once the proud new empire of science and industry, now used that industry for destruction. Factories produced shells instead of prosperity. Railways carried troops instead of commerce. The modern world had turned against itself. At home, the war reshaped German society. The British naval blockade tightened, cutting off food and raw materials. Hunger spread through cities. The turnip winter of 1916-1917 became a national trauma when starvation forced civilians to survive on animal feed. Women entered factories in massive numbers. Children grew thin. The promise of imperial glory dissolved into exhaustion. Yet the German leadership pressed onward, believing endurance could still bring victory. In 1917, a major shift occurred in the East. Russia, collapsing under its own war strain, erupted into revolution. The Tsar fell. Chaos consumed the empire. For Germany, this was opportunity. In March 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk ended the war in the East, granting Germany vast territories. For a moment, it seemed Germany could finally focus all strength on the West. In spring 1918, Germany launched massive offensives, a final gamble to break the stalemate before American power arrived fully. Stormtroopers advanced with speed. The front cracked. Paris seemed within reach. But Germany was running on its last reserves. The offensives stalled. The Allies counterattacked. American troops arrived in overwhelming numbers. By late 1918, Germany's armies were retreating. The war machine that had once seemed unstoppable was collapsing under exhaustion, blockade, and sheer material imbalance. At home, unrest spread. Sailors mutinied in Kiel, workers struck, revolution surged through cities. The German people, starved and broken, demanded an end. On November 9, 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and fled into exile. The empire that had been proclaimed in triumph in 1871 was gone. 2 days later, Germany signed the armistice. The guns fell, silent. But silence did not bring peace. Germany had lost millions. Its economy was shattered. Its monarchy had collapsed. And now the victors would impose a settlement that Germans would experience not as reconciliation, but as humiliation. In 1919, German delegates were summoned to Versailles. There, in the same palace where Germany had been unified, Germany was condemned. The Treaty of Versailles stripped territory, limited the army, demanded reparations, and placed sole blame for the war upon Germany. The psychological wound was immense. A new republic was proclaimed in Weimar, attempting democracy amid chaos. It was fragile from the start, haunted by defeat, burdened by economic collapse, attacked by extremists on left and right. Germany had entered the 20th century as an imperial giant. It emerged from World War I shattered, humiliated, and unstable one. The war had transformed Germany's destiny, and the consequences were only beginning. When the armistice was signed on November 11th, 1918, the guns fell silent across Europe. But silence did not mean peace. For Germany, the end of World War I was not a conclusion, it was a collapse. The empire that had risen so suddenly in 1871, forged in blood and iron, had entered the war as Europe's strongest industrial power. It had marched with confidence beneath imperial banners, believing victory would secure its place among the great empires of the world. Instead, it emerged broken. 2 million German soldiers were dead. Millions more were wounded, scarred, and lost to a generation that would never return whole. Cities were filled with amputees, widows, hunger, and grief. The war had consumed not only bodies, but faith in the old order. And the old order had fallen. The Kaiser's abdication ended the German monarchy. The imperial structure collapsed almost overnight. In its place, Germany proclaimed a republic, democracy born not from triumph, but from defeat. The Weimar Republic began in uncertainty, surrounded by enemies within and without. Germany's people faced chaos, returning soldiers with no work, revolutionary uprisings inspired by Bolshevik Russia, right-wing paramilitaries determined to crush socialism, and a society trembling between radical futures. The war had ended, but Germany's struggle had not. Then came Versailles. In 1919, German delegates were summoned to the Palace of Versailles, not as equals, but as the defeated. They entered the same halls where, only decades earlier, the German Empire had been proclaimed in triumph. Now those halls became a courtroom. The Treaty of Versailles imposed harsh terms. Germany lost Alsace-Lorraine to France. It surrendered territories in the east. Its colonies were taken. The army was reduced to a fraction of its former strength. Reparations were demanded on a scale that strained the nation's economy. And perhaps most devastating of all, Germany was forced to accept sole responsibility for the war, the infamous War Guilt Clause. To Germans, this was not justice. It was humiliation. The psychological wound cut deeper than borders. The republic that signed Versailles was immediately branded a betrayal by extremists who claimed Germany had been stabbed in the back. Conspiracy and resentment spread like poison through the fragile democracy. The modern age had arrived not with enlightenment, but with bitterness. The 20th century was revealing its harsh truth. Industrial power could create prosperity, but also catastrophe. Germany's rapid rise had bred fear in its neighbours, ambition in its rulers, instability in Europe's balance. World War I had transformed warfare into mechanized slaughter and transformed Germany from imperial giant into shattered republic. Yet even in ruin, Germany endured. The Weimar years would become an era of contradiction, cultural brilliance amid political chaos, artistic flowering amid economic collapse, fragile democracy amid growing extremism. Germany stood at a crossroads once again. The empire was gone. The republic was uncertain. The wounds of war remained open. And Europe, though exhausted, was not finished with conflict. The First World War had not resolved rivalries. It had only rearranged them. Germany's destiny, reshaped by defeat, now moved into a dangerous interwar period, where resentment, instability, and radical ideologies would gather strength. Thus, Chapter 10 is a meditation on modern power and modern catastrophe. How unity created ambition. How ambition created rivalry. How rivalry created war. And how war shattered an empire and left a nation searching for its future. But the next chapter approaches. When Germany's fragile democracy would collapse into dictatorship, and the darkest abyss of its history would open in the rise of Nazism and the catastrophe of World War II. Chapter 11, Dictatorship and the Abyss. In the aftermath of World War I, Germany stood in a landscape of fracture. The empire was gone. The Kaiser had fled. The old certainty of monarchy had collapsed into the fragile experiment of democracy. The Weimar Republic was born amid revolution and hunger, burdened by defeat and the harsh weight of Versailles. Germany was not at peace. It was wounded. The streets of Berlin and Munich filled with political violence. Communist uprisings flared, and right-wing militias answered with blood. Inflation eroded savings. Veterans returned to a society that could not absorb them. The nation lived with the humiliation of war guilt and the bitterness of lost territory. Democracy, in Germany's darkest hour, seemed fragile from the beginning. Yet the 1920s also carried moments of recovery. Brief stability, cultural brilliance, artistic flowering. Berlin became a center of modern thought and creativity. But beneath this surface, the foundations remained unstable. Then, in 1929, the world economy collapsed. The Great Depression struck Germany with devastating force. Banks failed. Factories closed. Unemployment soared into the millions. Families starved. Faith in democratic institutions shattered as the Republic appeared powerless against catastrophe. In crisis, societies search for answers. And in Germany, a dangerous answer was rising. Adolf Hitler. He was not born into power. He emerged from the chaos of defeat, a veteran of the trenches, a man who had absorbed Germany's humiliation and transformed it into fury. In the early 1920s, Hitler joined a small extremist movement, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party. His message was simple, brutal, intoxicating. Germany had been betrayed. The Republic was weak. The nation must be reborn through strength, unity, and racial purity. Hitler was not merely a politician. He was a propagandist of resentment. He offered scapegoats: Jews, communists, liberals, foreigners. He offered promises: restoration, greatness, revenge. In a society drowning in uncertainty, his certainty was seductive. In 1923, Hitler attempted a coup in Munich, the beer hall putsch. It failed. He was arrested and imprisoned. But prison did not end his rise. It refined it. There, Hitler wrote Mein Kampf, laying out an ideology of racial hierarchy, anti-Semitism, and expansionist ambition. He understood that power would not come through sudden revolt. It would come through the system itself. By the early 1930s, the Nazi Party surged electorally. Millions voted not necessarily out of fanaticism, but out of desperation. Democracy seemed unable to deliver stability. Extremism promised action. In January 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Many conservatives believed they could control him. They believed he was a tool. They were catastrophically wrong. Within weeks, the Reichstag fire provided the pretext for repression. Civil liberties were suspended. Communists were arrested. Opposition was crushed. In March, the Enabling Act gave Hitler dictatorial power. Germany's democracy died not in one dramatic overthrow, but through legal steps, fear, and manipulation. The Nazi regime moved swiftly to total control. Political parties were banned. Trade unions dissolved. The press was subordinated. The state became a machinery of surveillance and terror. The SS and Gestapo enforced obedience. Dissent became deadly. And at the heart of Nazi ideology was hatred. Anti-Semitism, long present in European history, was weaponized into state policy. Jews were excluded from public life, stripped of rights, targeted by relentless propaganda. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 formalized racial persecution. Germany was descending into moral abyss. The regime demanded unity, but it was unity through fear. It promised national rebirth, but it was rebirth through exclusion. And as Hitler consolidated power at home, his ambitions turned outward. Versailles would be overturned. Germany would expand. War was coming. The 20th century's darkest chapter was opening. Once Hitler had seized power, the transformation of Germany was rapid and terrifying. The Nazi regime did not simply govern, it consumed the state. Within months, Germany became a totalitarian system where loyalty was demanded, fear was normalized, and ideology penetrated every institution. Schools taught racial doctrine. Newspapers became instruments of propaganda. Public life was choreographed into mass rallies where torchlight and banners created the illusion of national unity. The regime called it renewal. In truth, it was domination. Hitler moved quickly to dismantle the restraints of Versailles. Germany rearmed openly, rebuilding an army far beyond treaty limits. In 1936, German troops marched into the demilitarized Rhineland. Europe protested but did not intervene. Each step emboldened the dictatorship. At home, persecution intensified. Jews were increasingly isolated, driven from professions, businesses, schools. Violence became public spectacle. In November 1938, Kristallnacht erupted. Synagogues burned, Jewish shops were smashed, thousands were arrested. The message was unmistakable. Germany's hatred was now state-sanctioned. The path toward genocide was opening. Hitler's ambitions were not limited to restoring Germany's borders. They were imperial. He sought Lebensraum, living space. In Eastern Europe, a vision of conquest built on racial ideology. Slavic peoples were deemed inferior. Jews were cast as existential enemies. War in Nazi thought was not merely political. It was racial destiny. In 1938, Germany annexed Austria in the Anschluss, greeted by crowds and coercion alike. Soon after, Hitler demanded the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. Britain and France, desperate to avoid war, conceded at Munich. Appeasement bought only illusion. In March 1939, Hitler seized the rest of Czechoslovakia. The world now understood. There would be no limit. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. World War II began. The war unfolded with shocking speed. German blitzkrieg tactics, combined armor, air power, rapid movement overwhelmed Poland. Britain and France declared war, but could not stop the conquest. In 1940, Denmark and Norway fell. Then the Netherlands, Belgium, and France collapsed. Paris was occupied. Germany stood triumphant over Western Europe. Yet Hitler's war was expanding toward catastrophe. In June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history. It was a war of annihilation. Entire villages were destroyed. Millions of Soviet prisoners were starved. Einsatzgruppen death squads followed the army, massacring Jews and others in mass shootings. This was genocide unfolding in the open. By 1942, the Nazi regime formalized the final solution: the systematic extermination of Europe's Jews. Death camps like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor became industrial centers of murder. 6 million Jews were killed, alongside Roma, disabled people, political prisoners, and others targeted by Nazi ideology. The Holocaust remains one of history's greatest crimes, an abyss of human cruelty organized by a modern state. Germany's cities, meanwhile, became targets of relentless bombing. The war that Hitler unleashed returned home in firestorms over Hamburg, Dresden, Berlin. By 1943-1944, Germany was retreating. Stalingrad shattered the myth of invincibility. Allied forces landed in Normandy. The Soviet army advanced from the east. The empire built on terror was collapsing. Yet Hitler refused surrender, dragging Germany into ruin. By the final months of World War II, Germany had become the very image of apocalypse. The regime that had promised national rebirth had delivered only ruin. The empire Hitler built through hatred and conquest was collapsing from every direction, and the German people, bound for years by propaganda and fear, now faced the full consequences of unchecked power. In the east, the Soviet Red Army advanced with relentless force, fueled by the devastation Germany had inflicted upon the Soviet Union. Cities like Königsberg and Breslau became battlegrounds of desperation. Refugees flooded westward through snow and fire, fleeing a war that had turned into vengeance. In the west, Allied armies crossed the Rhine, moving steadily toward the heart of the Reich. The skies belonged to bombers. German infrastructure crumbled. Factories fell silent. Railways lay twisted. The modern industrial power that had once astonished Europe now disintegrated into rubble. Berlin became the final tomb. In April 1945, Soviet forces encircled the capital. Street fighting erupted amid shattered buildings. The Third Reich, which had imagined itself as a 1,000-year empire, ended in weeks of chaos. Deep beneath Berlin, in the Führer bunker, Hitler refused reality until the end. On April 30th, 1945, he took his own life. Days later, Germany surrendered. The war was over, but the meaning of what had happened could not be contained by surrender documents. Germany's cities were burned. Millions were dead. Europe was scarred beyond measure. And at the center of the catastrophe stood the Holocaust, an industrialized genocide that revealed the depths to which a modern society could descend when hatred becomes law and human beings become targets. Germany's moral standing collapsed with its ruins. The Nazi regime was not merely a dictatorship of one man. It was a system sustained by institutions, compliance, terror, and the gradual erosion of conscience. The descent into extremism was not instant. It was step by step, crisis by crisis, until the unimaginable became normal. This is the chapter's darkest lessons. Civilization is not immune to barbarism. Modernity does not guarantee morality. A society can fall. In 1945, Germany lay divided and occupied. The Allies carved the country into zones of control. The old Reich was dismantled. The empire that had once sought domination was now under foreign authority, its future uncertain. The German people faced not only physical reconstruction, but moral reckoning. How could a nation rebuild after such crimes? How could memory coexist with survival? The unsummit abyss Germany entered would shape everything that followed. Its division during the Cold War, its long process of responsibility, its determination to prevent such darkness from returning. Thus ended Germany's deepest descent: dictatorship, war, genocide, and ruin. But history did not end in 1945. From the ashes, Germany would face a new chapter, not of conquest, but of rebuilding, division, and eventual reunification. For the next chapter approaches, when Germany, shattered and occupied, would be split into East and West, becoming the central frontier of the Cold War and the long struggle toward renewal. Chapter 12: Division, Rebuilding, and Modern Germany. In 1945, Germany was no longer a nation in triumph or ambition. It was a landscape of ruins. The cities that had once symbolized industry and culture, Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, lay shattered beneath smoke and rubble. Bridges were broken, railways twisted, millions were dead, millions displaced. The Third Reich had collapsed into silence, leaving behind not only physical devastation, but a moral abyss that could not be undone. Germany's war was over, but Germany's reckoning had only begun. The victorious Allied powers, America, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, divided Germany into occupation zones. The country was no longer sovereign. It was administered, controlled, dismantled, The Nazi state was abolished. War criminals were prosecuted at Nuremberg. The world confronted the horrors of the Holocaust with stunned gravity. Germany faced an unbearable question. How does a society rebuild after such catastrophe? In the immediate post-war years, survival was the first struggle. Winters were cold, food was scarce. Refugees flooded into the remaining German lands from the east, driven out of territories lost to Poland and the Soviet Union. Families searched for missing relatives among the rubble. Black markets replaced normal commerce. The nation existed in fragments, haunted by guilt and exhaustion. And yet, even amid ruin, history was moving forward. The alliance that had defeated Hitler did not remain united for long. The wartime cooperation between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union fractured into suspicion and ideological rivalry. The Cold War began. Germany, central in Europe, became its front line. In 1949, the division hardened into permanence. In the West, the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, was founded aligned with the United States and democratic capitalism. In the East, the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, was established under Soviet control, shaped by communist authoritarianism. One people, two states, two futures. West Germany began a remarkable transformation. Under Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, the Republic anchored itself in democracy, law, and integration with Western Europe. With American support through the Marshall Plan, the West German economy surged into recovery. Factories reopened. Cities were rebuilt. Prosperity returned with astonishing speed. This was the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. Yet beneath the new wealth lay the heavy burden of memory. West Germany had to confront its Nazi past, slowly and painfully, while building a new identity rooted in responsibility. In East Germany, the story was different. The communist state imposed strict political control. The Stasi, one of the world's most pervasive surveillance systems, monitored citizens relentlessly. The economy was planned, society disciplined, dissent crushed. The East became part of the Soviet bloc behind the Iron Curtain. Berlin, the former imperial capital, became the symbolic heart of division. In 1961, the East German regime built the Berlin Wall. Concrete, barbed wire, guard towers, sealing off the Western enclave. Families were separated overnight. Escape attempts ended in death. The wall became the most visible monument of the Cold War's tragedy. Germany was divided not only by politics, but by stone. And for decades it seemed permanent. Yet history, even in its coldest stasis, does not remain still forever. Beneath the surface, pressures accumulated. Economic stagnation in the East, growing demands for freedom, the slow erosion of Soviet authority. And in the late 1980s, the world began to change again. For nearly 3 decades, the Berlin Wall stood as if it were eternal, a concrete scar through the heart of a city, a boundary not only between East and West Germany, but between two world systems, communism and capitalism, authoritarian control and democratic freedom. Along its length, guard towers watched endlessly. Barbed wire glinted in cold light. Families remained separated by meters of stone that felt like continents. East Germany became one of the most tightly controlled societies on Earth. The Stasi built a network of surveillance so vast that neighbors feared neighbors, even within their own apartments. The state demanded conformity, loyalty, silence. Yet even the most rigid walls cannot stop history. In West Germany, democracy deepened, prosperity expanded. The country became integrated into NATO and the European Economic Community, anchoring itself in the Western order. A new generation grew up determined that dictatorship would never return. Meanwhile, the East stagnated. Its economy struggled. Its people watched West German television across the border, seeing a different life only kilometers away. The contrast was unbearable. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union itself was weakening. Under Mikhail Gorbachev, reforms of glasnost and perestroika loosened the grip of communist authority. Across Eastern Europe, movements for freedom surged. Germany's division was beginning to tremble. In 1989, protests erupted in East German cities. In Leipzig, crowds gathered in candlelit marches, chanting for liberty. Wir sind das Volk. We are the people. The demonstrations grew week by week, unstoppable, peaceful, immense. The East German regime hesitated. It could not reform enough to satisfy demands. It could not repress enough to survive. Then, on November 9th, 1989, the moment arrived. A confused government announcement suggested that travel restrictions would be lifted. Crowds surged towards the checkpoints. Guards, overwhelmed and uncertain, opened the gates. And suddenly, the wall, symbol of division for 28 years, was breached not by armies, but by ordinary people. Berlin erupted in celebration. Strangers embraced atop concrete. Hammers struck the wall as if breaking open history itself. The Cold War's most powerful symbol crumbled under human joy. The fall of the Berlin Wall was more than a German event. It was a European turning point. In the months that followed, East Germany unraveled rapidly. Communist authority collapsed. Free elections were held. The question that had haunted Europe since 1945 returned with full force. Could Germany become one again? In 1990, reunification came. The Federal Republic absorbed the East. Germany was whole for the first time since Hitler's defeat. The process was complex. Economic disparities, social tensions, cultural differences between East and West. But the symbolic meaning was immense. Germany had returned, not as an empire, not as a conqueror, but as a democratic republic. The nation that had once plunged Europe into catastrophe now sought to anchor Europe in unity. Modern Germany embraced remembrance as responsibility, building memorials, teaching history, confronting the crimes of the past openly. The wounds of division and dictatorship remained, but they became foundations for a new identity, democracy strengthened by memory. Germany emerged as Europe's leading economic power, a central pillar of the European Union, committed to peace after centuries of war. Yet its journey was extraordinary. From tribal frontiers beyond Rome to medieval empire, to fragmentation, to unification, to dictatorship, ruin, division, and finally renewal. Still, the story was not simply triumph. It was survival. It was reckoning. And it was the lesson that history's deepest scars can shape a nation's greatest responsibility. In October 1990, Germany stood whole again, not through conquest, not through imperial ambition, but through the collapse of a wall and the courage of ordinary people who demanded freedom. The reunification of Germany was one of the most symbolic moments of the modern age. A nation once shattered by war, divided by ideology, now restored in peace. Yet reunification was not the end of Germany's journey. It was the beginning of a new responsibility. But Germany carried a history unlike any other, a history of extraordinary achievement and unimaginable catastrophe. The modern German Republic emerged not as an empire, but as a democracy shaped by memory. The lessons of dictatorship and war were not forgotten. They became foundations. Germany invested deeply in remembrance, memorials to the Holocaust, education that confronted the past directly, a national commitment to ensuring that such darkness would never return. This was Germany's transformation, from power without restraint to power with responsibility. The decades after reunification were marked by challenge. Integrating East and West required immense economic effort. Industries in the former East collapsed under market competition. Social disparities lingered. Cultural differences remained. Yet over time, Germany rebuilt not only infrastructure but unity of identity. Berlin, once the symbol of division, became the capital of a reunited republic. A city where the scars of history remained visible, yet where new life rose among them. Germany also became central to Europe's future. It helped drive the expansion of the European Union, embracing the idea that cooperation, not rivalry, must define the continent after centuries of bloodshed. The nation that had once destabilized Europe now sought to anchor it. Modern Germany emerged as Europe's strongest economy, a leader in industry, science, and diplomacy. But unlike the Empire of 1914, its strength was bound to institutions, alliances, and democratic norms. Germany's story had come full circle. From tribal frontiers beyond Rome, to medieval empire, to centuries of fragmentation, to unification through war, to dictatorship and ruin, to division under the Cold War, and finally, to renewal through democracy. The German journey reveals one of history's deepest truths. Nations are not defined only by their triumphs, but by how they confront their failures. Germany's 20th century was an abyss, yet the post-war republic became one of the most striking examples of reconstruction, politically, morally, and socially. The scars did not vanish. They became reminders. And in those reminders, Germany found its modern purpose. To remember, to rebuild, to belong to Europe not as conqueror, but as partner, to hold power with restraint. Thus ends the complete history of Germany, from ancient forests to modern republic, from the shadow of Rome to the heart of the European Union, a story of endurance through fragmentation, transformation through catastrophe, and renewal through responsibility. And beneath the echoes of centuries, Germany stands today as proof that even the deepest wounds of history can become the foundations of a new chapter, one written not in conquest, but in remembrance and peace.